Welcome back to the Exponential Athlete podcast. This is part 3 of my 4-part series on Roger Federer. In this episode, we're going to talk specifically about the blueprint of Roger Federer's dominance. So it's one thing to play for a long time, like we talked about in the last episode. It's another thing to dominate and to dominate for a long time. So from 2003 to 2009, Roger Federer won 54% of the majors that he entered. That to me is an astronomical statistic. He also won majors 15 years apart. He won his first in 2003 and his last in 2008. That's dominance and performance over a long period of time. The question that we're going to answer or hope to answer in this episode is, how is he able to win so late into his career and at so many different stages in his career? What went into that dominance that he had? Obviously, a part of that was the training that we talked about in the last episode. But in this one, we're going to dive into some specific topics like the tactics he used, some of the technical details of his forehand, his backhand, his serve, and his racket, his philosophy on competition and how that aided him, his reputation, his mental approach, and how he organized his life around this performance goal. I think this is a good quote to sort of kick things off here. For the majority of his career, he's made the unbelievable believable. He took a rectangle and made curves where there were corners. He took a sport and defined its character, which had been built up for over a century before him with his own personal style. Given the players who came before, that is a pretty rare achievement. It truly felt at times that the sport hadn't been played until Roger came along. So something that I love about Roger Federer is he reinvented himself. He also kind of reinvented the game as it was changing more towards this idea of people staying at the baseline and bashing. He brought old school tennis and new school tennis and combined them into a beautiful art form. And part of that is strategy. Part of that is playing to his strengths with his technique. And part of that is his mental approach of evolution. So we're going to dive into all those things. But first, we're going to start with tactics, which I believe is synonymous with strategy. But it's also how his specific skill set fits into the strategy that he applies on the tennis court. The 2004 final is memorable for Roddick's post-match quote about Federer. "I threw the kitchen sink at Roger, but he went to the bathroom and got the tub." So this was at the 2005 US Open when Roger beat Roddick in the finals. And that is the epitome of Roger's game. He is able to have access to tools and leverage tools that other people don't. And this metaphor to me was one, really funny, but also a perfect representation of Roger's game. Tactics, people talk about tactics, Federer said. But a lot of the time at this level, it just comes down to instinct. It happens so fast that you have to hit the shot almost without thinking. There's of course some luck involved. So we're also going to talk about how tactics and instinct fit together. We talked a lot about with Kobe, how structure enables creativity. There's going to be some similar threads along those lines as well. Roger has great hands, but he also has a mind to come up with all these different little things. He took the sport to the next level with his artistry. Before Roger, tennis was heading in a very one-dimensional direction, Agassi style. And then suddenly along comes Federer, who not only plays completely differently, but he toys with his opponents, who hits a short slice backhand and asks the other guy to come in. It's nearly obnoxious to do that. I'm not saying he would ever consider that being obnoxious, but as a tactical move, it's freaking obnoxious. So another wrinkle of this is what strategies, what tactics, what things is he coming out and using that are fundamentally different than other people? He's reinventing the game. He's trying new things. He's experimenting, and he's innovating in tennis like no one has in a long period of time. So the first thing I want to dive into is, how do we separate instinct from tactics or intuition from tactics? I was struck by his capacity to take incredible risks on important points. He went for shots that I did not consider reasonable with the success rate that ended up driving me crazy. So the thing is, people see Roger play and hit some of these incredible shots out of seemingly nowhere. They're not high percentage shots. They don't necessarily make sense, but Roger is reacting. He's fully committing to those. And it's not always going to be optimal. I don't think any athlete outside of maybe a golfer who has a long time between each individual shot can truly make the most high percentage play every single time. or decide to make the most high percentage every single time. Roger has to let go and just act on instinct some of the time. And that produces what many believe to be beautiful tennis, but inefficient tennis. But of the tennis he plays and compared to his competitors, his tennis is still more efficient than theirs, even though he's relying on instinct a lot of the time. Roger Federer probably will go down as the smartest tennis player that's ever played because of his variety. But I tell people, you know why he's smart? Because he's not thinking. He's just reacting because he's so good at everything. If he's thinking with everything. He's thinking with his whole body. I've learned so much from watching him just playing. This is what I'm trying to teach the people I play with, the kids I play with. You're going to be as smart as possible by not thinking. The best tennis players are not thinking, they're feeling it. And Roger is the master of that. So he's describing Roger as really smart, but he's also saying he's smart by not using his brain on the court. This to me, although it seems paradoxical, it makes so much sense. Again, just with that Kobe example that we described, you're creating structure so that frees you up on the court. So he knows what his game plan is. He knows exactly how he practices and the things that he's working on. And since he has a very clear game plan, and since he's approaching it with a lot of structure, that means he can be improvisational. He can work within the confines of what he's already created and be free to play his best tennis. We're going to talk a little bit later about his self-talk, and you'll hear him how he talks to himself, mostly about how he can free himself up, not what he's supposed to do, which I really like. And that's something that will compound over time. Roger also emphasizes adaptability and variety in his play style and in his strategy. So this is different from the adaptability with his body and the variety with his training. This is a different type of advantage, leveraging those two same things. It was very apparent what a natural fit his game was for grass. And the thing that doesn't get talked about enough is how he could mix things up on grass. He's won Wimbledon staying back 95% of the time. He's won it serving and volleying 80% of the time. So depending on the conditions, he was able to adjust. That tactical variety does indeed set Federer apart from his role models. He did not, like Becker, Edberg, or Sampras, rely on essentially the same Wimbledon game plan year after year. With his wide range and comfort zone, he adapted to the opposition, to the racket and string technology, to the grass itself, which Wimbledon altered in the early 2000s, creating a firmer surface that produced a more reliable, slightly higher bounce that was more friendly to baseliners. So he could change his game to the court conditions, to his opponents, even to adapt to new technologies. So we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the racket technology has changed so that you can essentially get more speed and spin while having a bigger racket face. And that was difficult for Roger because what was working against his opponents wasn't working quite as well because they evolved with the times and started using new rackets. And so he was able to develop and learn and adjust to the new science associated with that, as well as these other factors. To me, that's really incredible. So Roger is very much a jack of all trades, but he seems to be almost a master of all of them. And that reminds me very much of Kobe Bryant as well. So Kobe is working on all these different things. We use the Bruce Lee analogy. You'd rather fight someone who's done 1,000 kicks one time each rather than one kick 1,000 times. But Kobe and Roger seem to have been doing thousands of shots, thousands of times, and they can create this variety and add all these wrinkles to their game. And that gives them a tremendous variability and tremendous adaptability to any new opponent, any new challenger, which to me is what we want in sport. That gives you an incredible amount of resilience. So this is one of Roger's playing opponents on Roger. When I played well, I could keep up quite a high pace and change it up, but my high pace wasn't enough to put him in trouble in the long run. And Roger is extremely skillful in changing the pace. So when I changed the pace, he did it even better by using his slice. He took my weapons away. When I was at my peak, I played smart and in a very different way. I changed tactics and the pace during the match, but Roger is so complete that he was always able to adapt. So in tennis, you're playing against a bunch of different opponents, and every opponent is adjusting either to you or adjusting their game to the conditions. And being able to adjust better is an advantage. It's not just being able to adjust in general. Roger is able to adapt to all these different games by playing so much tennis, by seeing all these people, and by building variety and adaptability into his game, which I think is incredible. We don't always look at adaptability is one of the greatest strengths because it's probably one of the hardest skills to develop over time. You have to have a lot of hours. You have to be relatively well-rounded. And in the world we live in now, specialization is one of the things that a lot of people are focusing on. So we talked about range in the last part. To me, we can also extend range to the ability to play these different shots, the ability to adapt to these different conditions. And that's something that in Roger's career served him incredibly well. Roger has a weaker backhand, for instance, but amazingly, he used his weakness in the next match as a weapon. So he's also pretty strategic about what his deficiencies are and how he can leverage those. So how would he leverage a backhand as a weapon? So if he knows people are going to play to his backhand more, that helps him with his footwork and his positioning on the court. He can start getting around those. He can start anticipating those shots earlier. He also, if he's in secret working on his backhand, which he essentially did in 2016, 2017, when everyone's playing to his backhand, and that is now a really dominant, powerful, and aggressive shot, no one is ready for the returns that they're getting. So he came in and essentially dominated in 2017 because he remodeled his backhand. What people thought was his weakest part of his game became another strength that he could rely on. Even so, there's an outlier who will not be ignored. Federer has gone further than anyone else in trying to keep the art alive. And this happened when he was in his 30s, at a stage when he's not supposed to be trying new things. And it's helped him remain as a force in the sport. It might seem strange to the tennis youth, but a volley can be a weapon. Whether it follows a serve, a sneak attack by Roger, or a more conventional approach shot. Federer can serve and volley, he can also return and volley, and off a regular rally ball, he can charge forward and volley. Charging into the net has become the style of tennis that Federer had become accustomed to watching. Serve and volley was also the strategy his first proper coach, Peter Carter, had advocated he should adopt. That dash into the service box, so unnerving for some, was fine for Federer. And this is all about the sneak attack by Roger. I want to dive a little bit deeper into that. But Roger being able to switch up these types of games gives him an advantage among everyone else. A lot of people, if they can only play one style of game, if that style of game is not working against your opponent, if it's not a good matchup, a lot of people are just stuck doing what they're doing and they just have to keep grinding on that. Roger has the ability to off-balance his opponents by switching things up. He also, if something is not working, he has other strengths to rely on and he can try different approaches, which can be good for getting unstuck sometimes. I think the sneak attack by Roger is a really interesting case study of how Roger was able to adapt late in his career, not just to his opponents, but also to his career stage. So let's dive into that a little bit more. But then came the 2014 championships, the first since the collaboration with Stefan Edberg began, and Federer's rate of serve and volley doubled from the summer before to 22%. Such an approach would take him into his first Grand Slam final for 2 years. In the championship match, where he extended Novak Djokovic to 5 sets, Federer took 44 points at the net. So this is defying convention in the sense that serve and volley was essentially a dying art at the time. And also, serve and volley is highly aggressive. It's a faster paced game. And usually you'd think as you get older, later into your career, you try to slow the game down. But that is exactly the opposite of what Roger was doing. Peter Lundgren once told the Swiss journalist René Stauffer how Federer hated volleys. It was a surprising comment given how Federer's idols, Peter Carter, played the game. Roger played as if sharks were lurking at the net in the service box, Lundgren said. We drove off the sharks by training a lot. So this style of play that he adopted late, early in his career, he hated it. He didn't like going up to the net. To me, that's an incredible advancement. To take something you don't like doing and to make it a strength of your game. What type of willpower, what type of creativity, what type of imagination does it take to be able to make that transition for him? Edberg disclosed how the first he had known about the sneak attack by Roger had been when he had seen it on television. In fact, it had been Luthi who was instrumental in the use of the SABR, which involved playing half volley returns when just short of the service line, and then rushing towards the net. Federer enjoyed hitting the new shot in practice, but it was Luthi who urged him to take it from training to competition, telling Federer not to be afraid of using the sneak attack by Roger in big moments. So there's a couple things to unpack here is that first, it's his coaches that are encouraging him to do this. Well, even before that, Roger is experimenting with these things in practice. We saw how Kobe Bryant, when he would workshop stuff with his friends at the JCC, then he'd bring it onto the street ball courts, then he'd bring it on to high school, and then he'd try it at the highest level he was playing at the time, which is AAU. Roger is doing the same thing. He's fooling around, trying these things in practice. And I think it's awesome that they encouraged him to do this in live games. He didn't break it out in the first major championship. He broke it out in some other events before that, and he started to have success with it. He started using it more. That experimental nature, or that approach to training in an experimental way, to me is a super poignant point for any athlete. The sneak attack by Roger, we'll talk a little bit about later, how it had an impact on his backhand. It actually improved some of the other areas of his game. And to me, that's an interesting thing, how we talked about cross-training with different, clay and grass in the last episode. There's another area where there's overlap. Roger was not afraid to challenge convention. So we talked about how the sneak attack by Roger was different for his age. Again, he's speeding the game up. This dives a little bit more into that. Of course, there's a huge amount you can take out of his game, the vision, how he sees the court. For me, what was remarkable, when he took his time out in 2016 when he had a knee surgery, then he came back, and instead of, like us old guys, trying to slow the game down because we need more time, we're getting slow, he comes in and he's rocketing the speed up. He's like, you know what, guys? I'm going to play faster. Everyone was like, what the hell is going on? So Roger is looking at this from a second order perspective. In the Kobe series, we talked about how Kobe was with Adidas lobbying for, not high top shoes, essentially like ankle cut shoes, because he saw soccer players having less ankle injuries, them being able to flex their Achilles more and strengthen their Achilles more with low tops rather than high tops. Challenges convention in a unique way. And Roger is doing the same thing here. By playing more aggressive and playing faster, he's running less. The points are shorter. So he's preserving his body for the longer term. Yes, maybe there's more immediate stress by playing faster, but over the course of the last leg of his career where he's speeding the play up, he's running dramatically less than any of the other players that are on the court. And if you look at it from that perspective, this is a really logical and seemingly sensical play, but other people are not viewing it that way because they're looking at it from the laws of convention, which I think is important for us to look at the base principles instead. Roger had a micro view of tennis, being able to adapt to the individual players he was playing against, but he also had this macro view of tennis where he was able to adapt to the times. I don't think that there's a better example of his understanding of this is when he's describing it to Pete Sampras. Pete's like, no one's coming in at Wimbledon anymore. How does that happen? How's it working? And Roger thinks about it for a second and then basically explains the evolution of one era into the next for Pete. And this goes on for a couple of hours. So obviously I'm not going to take a couple hours to explain that evolution. What Federer explained was that when nearly everyone served and volleyed on the grass, staying back was the wrong choice because it would have meant hitting too many passing shots. But as equipment and playing styles changed, Federer realized that he had an edge over the field from the baseline too, just as he did on hard courts and even on clay against players not named Nadal. So Roger is constantly weighing all of the variables, the equipment, the style of play for other people, and he's catering his game to that. He's also building in his own strengths. To me, that is the epitome of strategy, is what do I have? What do the other people have? How do I take what I have and go strategically about beating other people with that? Or do I have to develop a new skill to be able to beat those people because what I currently have isn't enough? Something that a ton of people talk about in regards to Roger's variety is how unpredictable he is when he's returning shots, he's hitting serves, he's doing all these things. But what I found most interesting is that unpredictability for the large part is a myth. And I want to dive really deep into that because philosophically, this is important for any athlete. If you want to confuse your opponents, if you want to get an advantage, would you rather have people think that you're completely random, or would you rather be able to trick people based on what they expect you to do? Roger is the most unpredictable of all of them. He has so much talent and can play any shot, Djokovic said. I think the worst thing for any tennis player or any athlete to deal with is unpredictability, not knowing what's coming next. That's what Roger possesses, the variety in his game. And so that's what plays with your mind. What's coming next? Djokovic talked about Federer's so-called sneak attack by Roger, in which he moved unusually close to the service box to hit a half volley return. Will he do his saber thing, Djokovic said? Will he come to the net? Will he stay back? Will he chip it? Will he hit it? It keeps you guessing all the time. And that's why it's so tough to play Roger. So Roger's range in his game, his variability of hitting shots is intimidating. And it's difficult to deal with because you don't necessarily know what's coming. But on the other hand, is that true randomness or is there something else involved? It's tempting to romanticize Federer's beautiful tennis and to believe he plays primarily, if not purely, on instinct. The truth is, he appears to think more about the strategies of tennis than anyone else in the sport. It might surprise people to know that Roger is very pattern-oriented, with those patterns changing based on the score. So this is according to Craig O'Shaughnessy, who's one of the major tennis analysts. The aim for Federer is not to be considered unpredictable and for his opponent to be entirely reliant on guesswork. No, far better to create an illusion in his opponent's head that they know which serve is coming. Federer wants his opponents to believe, wrongly of course, that they can predict the future. He sticks to his patterns, and they're strong, recognizable patterns, said O'Shaughnessy, who studied Federer's serve for years. This goes back to the theory of Pavlov's dog. Some people seem to think that in tennis, you want a shotgun or scattershot approach, that it should be very random. But you don't want that because you can't control that. You'll start to second guess yourself. You won't be quite sure what you're supposed to be doing next. And you'll go for a low percentage shot on a really important point, and it just catches up with you. What you want is Pavlov's dog. You want to ring the bell for the opponent to expect a certain response. You're conditioning their response and their minds, and then you can manipulate them. So think about that. Rather than just truly being random, humans don't necessarily work in random patterns. So if I was trying to be random and hitting random shots all the time, that would be a massive amount of cognitive load because I wouldn't know what to do. But so Roger can solve this in two ways. So first, he has a game plan and he tries to condition people. That allows him to know what he's going to do and lets him execute on that. The second thing is he can start to condition these other players and he can, at will, choose to mix them up or to mix things up on them. Most players, O'Shaughnessy disclosed, are hurt by their self-obsession, not Federer. Roger is always inside the opponent's mind. With Roger, a hidden element of his brilliance is the constant awareness of what his opponent is expecting and thinking. Most players think they should be focusing on their strokes and they believe it's all about me. It's not. You don't necessarily need to play well. You just need to have your opponent playing badly. Get inside their mind and figure out what they're thinking. Let's think about that in terms of Roger's extroversion, how interested he is in people. It seems like it's all coming together that his interest in people and understanding how they think and their background and all these things, it helps him to empathize and get into the other tennis players' heads. Those two skills are parallel. And Roger is able to do this unlike any player that we've really seen before. And I really like this because this is an advantage that Roger has that is in line with the other character traits that he has. He's able to do this in such a unique way. There's plenty of examples on Roger's serve and the specifics of his tactics around that. There's plenty of examples of how he approaches his inside-out forehand and running around his backhand in the book Fedographica. But that's a little out of scope. That's a little bit more tennis-focused. I think it would be useful for any athlete to dive into. But again, that's a little too deep here. I'm going to try to start producing my full notes for everyone to listen to. I don't know if I'll do that on Patreon or some other place. But if you're interested in that, please let me know on my socials. In order for Federer to manipulate people, in order for him to give the air of unpredictability, there's something pretty important that's a prerequisite for that. Of course, deception is nothing without accuracy. Where's the benefit of running these patterns if you can't hit your spots? Federer can place the ball pretty much wherever he pleases. His smooth service action has allowed him to be extraordinarily consistent and to keep his first serve percentage so high. At difficult moments, on the big points, Roger always gets the ball in. So Roger, he has good zip on the forehand. His serve is fast, but it's not world-beating fast. Roger is getting the most advantage by indexing on accuracy and getting inside his opponent's head and the strategy and the tactics around when to hit what type of shot. I really like that. Some people can overwhelm you with speed. Roger is indexing on combining two forces, accuracy and tactics, that give him what he believes to be the highest level of advantage. That's when you're the most dangerous for your opponent, according to Federer. Don't always hit it in the same spot. What you want to do early in the match is to show your opponent that you can hit all the shots, so when it gets important in the match, he doesn't know where it's going to go. I can hit a slice, the topspin, and the flat backhand. I try to mix it up as much as I can. But at the same time, I also need to be able to make enough in a row just for consistency and also for confidence. So Federer is conscious about how all of these things fit together. He knows that in order to execute his game plan in the late sets, if it gets there, he has to be accurate. He has to prove to his opponent and get in their head that he can hit all of these shots. Roger is one of the best, maybe ever, at creating an aura for his opponents that he can do everything, that it comes easy to him. But he does that through execution. Maybe his approach, he's hitting slightly less risky shots early in the game, just so he can showcase that he can do it. Obviously, Tiger had this aura around him all the time, and he was very careful about how he cultivated that. But I think this is a common thread between Tiger and Federer as well. So what specifically makes it difficult to play Roger about this? Yes, you don't really know what's coming, but let's hear some examples from players about the challenges that they faced. Soderling, who only beat the Swiss player once in the 2010 Roland Garros final, out of the 16 times he faced him, knows exactly why he played so poorly. He would make me play poorly. I could win or lose against Nadal, but there was much more rhythm. You know he can run for 5 hours, that all the balls are going to come back, and that he's an incredible player. Out of the 6 times I played him, I probably played well 4 or 5 times, because it's not as hard to play against Nadal as it is to Federer. It was 8 times really, with 6 wins for the Spaniard and 2 for the Swede, who's still obsessed with how indecipherable the Swiss player's game is, and with his capacity to concentrate. So what made Federer so difficult is, how do you create a game plan against someone who can vary their skills so much? Especially if you're doing something really well and they can neutralize it with a different type of shot, you're forced to adapt if he's already beating you to the punch and can adapt to your game plan very effectively. To me, this is really incredible. Is if you have variety, you make it really difficult leading up to the match to anticipate what you're going to do. Nadal's game was a little bit more consistent. You knew what you were facing. The fear of the unknown in what you're facing in Federer is another incredible advantage that he creates. Roger's able to do so many different things that every single time you play him, even though you might go into the match with a plan to play in a certain way, he might have the goal to do something completely different. And then you're the one adjusting. He can play one match against you, chipping every single return, and then he'll play you the next time. And even though he beat you the previous time by chipping, now he's going over the ball. He's always changing it up. And the reason he does that is that he's able to. I think he has the most capabilities and dimensions of any tennis player I've ever known. I think that's a really good way to, I guess I kind of ran over the point there, but that is a perfect articulation of what I was trying to describe. This is Agassi on a similar concept. Sampras was great, no question, but there was a place you could get to with Pete. You knew what you had to do. If you did it, it could be on your terms. There's no such place like that with Roger. There's a sense of urgency on every point, on every shot. If you do what you're supposed to do, you feel like it gives you a chance to win the point. That's just too good. He plays the game in a special way that I haven't seen before. He's got a plan A, plan B, a plan C, all the way down the alphabet. If one thing's not working, he's got other tools. And you can see how well he's developed as an athlete. His hands are a joke, his legs are super strong, his build is ideal for the game, but it turns into a chess match. So we talked about this before. Well, I think we've talked about this before, but the idea of having some form of plan is better than having no plan at all. And so Roger, with his strategy, he has all these plans he can go down the list with, and that leaves his opponents having to adjust rather than Roger having to adjust. To me, that's a pretty incredible thing, is if you're controlling the pace, you're controlling the match by what you do, you're always going to have the advantage in that sense. This isn't always a good thing, though. With variety, there's drawbacks to it. There's a reason why there's very few people who have been able to maintain this variety for a long period of time and to really dominate with variety. Especially early in Roger's career, he often had too many options, and he faced what I call the paradox of choice. If that sounds like a straightforward formula, it was not. Federer, with his mental combustibility and a manifold tactical options, would need more time than some of his peer group to learn how to make the right shot selections and experience consistent success. So if you can hit a forehand 5 different ways, 10 different ways, how do you know what you're going to hit when the ball's coming to you? This can be overwhelming if you're either not habitualizing something or you don't have a game plan going in. As a young man, Federer was bewildered by choice. While more limited players had a strong idea of which shot to play at any given moment, Federer had so many different strokes to choose from that it became tricky to decide. When a slow ball came over the net, he was mentally flicking through the catalog. He said, "My range of shots was a problem. You get a slow ball and you think, what am I going to do with this? If your game is limited, it's simple and you have a shot for every situation and you play it. I had too many options and I had to learn to choose the right shots and the right tactics," he explained. As John McEnroe noted, Federer had so many options that he confused himself. What Federer needed was just some order, structure, and rhythm to the game. Just as he runs patterns for his serve, he does the same for the rest of his tennis. So Federer is able to simplify things through patterns. And patterns are good for him because he knows them. And the game of tennis moves so fast that it can be difficult for his opponents to pick them up. He can also change his patterns, and he knows what the pattern changes are when his opponents don't. I mean, he had results before that, but managers and people around would say, "What's wrong? Why doesn't he win more?" And I told them he's not ready yet. His game is big, he's got a huge game, and it takes time to choose the right weapon for the right shot. He had so many tools in his bag, he probably had 15 on each shot. So part of evolution, part of improvement, part of winning is figuring out how to leverage the specific tool set that you have. He had this huge tool set. The biggest factor for him was strategy and figuring out the game plan and creating the structure around that. I think that's something most athletes completely overlook. You might have all the skills and you're wondering why you don't perform when you should. This is probably the reason, is you're not narrowing down the options that you have before you play. You're not creating plans, you're not creating strategy. And in order to do that, you have to add some form of structure to how you approach things. Again, in the books, there's a lot more deep dives into on-court strategy. I wanted to just do a little short example of how he approached the game on the court. More than any other member of the Big Four, so the Big Four is Nadal, Murray, and Djokovic, Federer's inclination has always been to attack, being the aggressor in the rally, sat comfortably with his general approach to tennis. As a teenager and then in his 20s, Federer had always aimed to finish off points as quickly as possible, whether from the back of the court or from the advanced position at the net. Now in his 30s, there was even more reason for Federer to take the initiative and shorten the rallies. That way he could avoid the baseline grind. So obviously this paid off over time. His aggressive play was something that was really important. This is the case study I was describing. So we're going to talk a little bit about why he runs around his backhand. So running around your backhand means you get a backhand ball and you run around it to hit your forehand. For a lot of people, this is an inefficient shot because it puts you out of position. So why does Roger routinely do it, especially earlier in his career? There are 3 reasons, the analyst Craig O'Shaughnessy said, why Federer runs around his backhand to play a forehand. Firstly, he's upgrading from a backhand to a forehand, and a lot of it's about miles per hour. It's just a bigger shot and one which can do damage to an opponent's psyche. You're saying to your opponent, "Let me put this pistol down and grab a rifle." The second reason is that Federer doubles his target area. You're opening up the court and have so much more court to aim at. Thirdly, Roger has complete disguise. I've looked at some of Roger's run-around forehands frame by frame, and the opponent was split-stepping up and down as he had no clue where the ball was going. Even as the racket is approaching the ball, you don't know. The opponent's reaction time is taken away. Blake had a long look at Federer. His first realization was that once Federer took control of a point, it was a huge challenge to get the ball to his less dangerous backhand. He was that quick. He moves so well that if he gets a forehand, you can't get him to hit another backhand, Blake said. Once he hits a forehand, he's completely controlling the point. That was just incredible. So again, Roger is sacrificing more optimal footwork for more control psychologically and over the tide of the game. To me, that's not a decision maybe every coach would recommend to every player, but for Roger, he realizes that strategically, that's a better option. Later in his career, he didn't necessarily do this as much because his backhand dramatically improved. This is also another example of Roger essentially defying convention or relying on instinct, or also choosing the specific shot that gives him the biggest perceived advantage at the time being. I just want to reiterate that this style of play that Roger chooses, even in this circumstance where he's running around and technically moving further to hit inside out forehand, he's over the course of the matches very likely limiting how much he's going to be moving. He realizes the points are probably going to be shorter if he hits a forehand, an aggressive forehand, rather than just hitting a backhand in play. He's also coming to the net. He's working heavily on his footwork with his coaches. And all these things mean that he is running dramatically shorter than his opponents. And this means longevity for his overall career. From a strategy perspective, I also want to do a little deeper dive into his performance against Nadal. So earlier in his career, Nadal really seemed to have his number, especially on clay. But later in his career, Roger was able to crack the code of Nadal. And there's a big question of who's the better tennis player. Nadal has more majors now. Djokovic even has more majors than that now. But being the better tennis player isn't necessarily about how many majors you have or even head-to-head matchups, because head-to-head matchups have stylistic aspects. So was it truly that Rafa was better than Roger, or was he a more challenging stylistic matchup? Both of those things can be true, but I think it's important to evaluate that on a one-to-one level. Federer doesn't lose to Nadal because he's worse than Nadal. He loses against Nadal because he does poorly against Nadal's system of play. This brings up the memory of all the times that Federer lamented the fact that Nadal is left-handed. Why is Nadal's system of play the worst one that Federer could be up against? First point, everything that Federer does to damage his rivals only does half the damage to Rafa. Second point, the system that Rafa uses to do the most damage to his rivals is the system that does the most damage to Federer. And the system Federer uses to do the most damage to his rival is the one that does the least damage to Rafa. So Federer dominates his rivals with his forehand and inverts it from the inside out to attack the backhand and get them out of the court. The shot goes towards Rafa's right, no problem for him because that's his forehand. So just the handedness of Nadal is something that gives him a challenge. Rafa also hits a high spinny forehand, especially on clay, to Roger's backhand, which is Roger's weakest shot. So handedness is something that's interesting. We talked with Will Wu. Handedness is a myth. So if you're having a kid playing tennis, maybe put the racket in his left hand. That might give him the biggest advantage against right-handed players over the course of their career. So how did Roger turn this around and start beating Rafa later in his career? The core of Federer's game plan was quite simple. Hit through the backhand aggressively without retreating deeper behind the baseline over the course of the match. It was a familiar challenge, and through the years, he had started with a similar intent against Nadal and then gradually given up ground under the cumulative pressure of his retching topspin. But he now had a weapon better suited to the task after his switch to a racket with a 97 square inch head. He had definitively made the move in the summer of 2014 after more than a year of exhaustive experimentation and fine-tuning. The change from his 90 square inch model gave him more power and an 8% larger surface area, increasing the sweet spot and reducing mishits. So it's not just necessarily that Roger got better at hitting the backhand. He was trying to do this earlier in his career, but his body, his technique, and the technology he was using didn't match up to be able to overcome the Rafa challenge. Later in his career, all these things come together for him to be able to solve this riddle. I also really want to focus on the idea of matchups in tennis. Matchups in tennis are very different than most other sports, except for maybe fighting or some of these types of things. You have to make these game plans very specifically for who you're playing. And as we talked about before, you have to work on general skills to beat everyone, but also specific skills to beat one person. And that balance can be very difficult to find over the course of your career. For example, Rafa completely dominates in the French Open. The clay works unbelievable for the amount of topspin he creates on his forehand. How much time should you be spending trying to solve that riddle when you have to beat players on other different course styles, on grass and on hard court? And are you going to get diminishing returns really trying to just beat him on clay? Because that still might not happen, even if that's the case. The last thing I want to focus on related to tactics are mind games. So Roger is unbelievably nice. He's super friendly, but there are things that he does that really get into the head of his opponents, whether it's consciously or unconsciously that he's doing this. Andre Agassi tells a story, and don't let anyone suggest this is apocryphal, of how he would read Boris Becker's serve just by looking at his tongue. As Becker tossed the ball up, he would unwittingly stick out a tiny red arrow, Agassi called it, pointing in the direction in which he was about to take fire. Even before the ball had left Becker's strings, Agassi could start following that arrow. To think that Becker, unknowingly sabotaged by his subconscious mind, would inspire Federer, who has learned to condition and manipulate the receiver, supposedly in secret, his rivals seem to be unaware that this is happening and how they're being played. Federer's ongoing experiment is available for all to see if you only know what to look for. Roger is not just looking for what people do well, he's looking to see what other triggers can be pulled or levers can be pulled to give him an advantage. Roger is also described as wearing a mask or that he's like James Bond when he's on the court. This is really intentional and it gives him a unique advantage. Through the years, it was often difficult to judge Federer's degree of physical distress. He always tried so hard to make it look like everything was okay. He had so many bad backs and blocked necks, he would always make sure that nobody knows and nobody sees anything. But that's Roger. He's able to function normally even when things are not great. Plus, the thing that Federer showed was that if you walked into a match and didn't look at the score, you wouldn't know if he was up or down. He didn't show his opponent that he was worried or down. And that is an art. His opponents didn't know if they had him or if he was in trouble because he always had that positive note from the start to the finish. So there's two elements of that. Off the court, he seems like he's doing fine all the time. He's giving off this incredible aura of, oh, he's not even human. I have all these issues and he doesn't have any. That's a massive psychological advantage. On the court, he's doing the same thing. He's able to get into his opponent's head by seeming unflappable. You think about any sport that you're playing that is physically demanding, you know what your body's going through. You don't know what your opponent's body is going through. If you're Rafa Nadal and your feet are hurting and your blown out knee is acting up and your wrist is sore and Federer looks like he's barely sweating, how is that going to affect you psychologically? Roger also, as I mentioned a little bit before, in I believe it was part 2, he hides some stuff from the public. In part, the idea of Roger the amateur has been fueled by his decision not to invite the world to inspect his training regime. So Novak and Rafa, they invite the media, the press in to watch him work out. Rafa's working out without a shirt on and showing off all his muscles, and they see how hard he's working. Roger's cultivated the opposite image, where people don't know what he's doing. He's so laid back, he's lackadaisical, he must practice really laid back. But nobody really knows, and that creates an aura around him that can give him an advantage. Roger is also quite a bit larger than life with his opponents, and we're going to touch really deep into this with his relationship with the media and his image, but I wanted to put a little teaser here. I was with my coach trying to say, okay, I know Roger. I know I can play on grass. Let's see what happens. You try to believe in yourself and you try to win, but you can see when you have him in front of you, he's moving, he's so smooth, he's so fast. He knows when to push. He knows when he has the momentum. He has an answer to everything when he decides to accelerate, boom. On grass, that's really impressive. It impressed me a lot. Think about how intimidating that is if everything you do looks effortless, everything looks smooth, everything, the crowd expects you to win. There's all these forces stacked up against you when you're playing Roger, not to mention your own mind. Roger also will, for example, toy around in matches. He sometimes appears to lack this seriousness, and I think that this gives him an additional air. The game within the game, how he plays the ball to the ball kids on the other side after a serve is wide. He's like, give me the ball. I want to hit it and see if the guy can stand still and catch it in his hand. People don't realize that he's breaking the etiquette rules if he misses the ball kid over there, because he's now causing a larger period between the first and second serve. It's not like he can close his eyes and just hit the ball and hope that he hits the ball kid. No, he has to be focused on hitting the chip back to the kids. What kind of focus does the guy have when he's paying attention to such things that don't count? I mean, it's unbelievable. Andre Agassi used to be the opposite. When you read his book, you know what happened. He's hit too many tennis balls to love the sport. Then he learned how to love competition later in his life. Roger, on the other hand, loves to toy with the ball. So Roger toys with the ball. He toys with his opponents. He's playful. He's not showing nerves when he's doing this. He knows it can slow the game down, but that's the other guy's problem, not necessarily his problem. The last mental advantage that Roger creates is through playing on center court. So since he's had this incredible career, he's been famous for a long time, he is at home on center court. The courts are bigger, there's different environments. It's arguably like a home field advantage. Chatting to Tony afterwards, they said they were very, very upset that he wasn't on center. And I can fully understand that. Ironically, because he played so much of his tennis on center, it would be a significant disadvantage for him to be on court number one. The wind moves in a different direction. The sun is a different place. However much you say that the courts are identical, there must be subtleties, which have got to be known to him more than me, because of course the rest of us don't get to see that comparison. So I realize this section on tactics was a little bit long, but this, in my mind, might be one of the most important sections on Roger Federer. He gets these unique advantages in so many different ways. He's obviously skillful. He obviously is healthy and flexible and mobile, but it's about how he puts all of these together to win. And we all have attributes that we're good at. We all have things that are strengths. If we combine our strengths with our strategy in an effective way, we can create a really good advantage. Again, this is the overarching concept of the podcast: is if we combine things and we do them over time, we get a lasting advantage that makes us better than anyone else. So when we're looking internally, what is our approach to our craft? What strategy do we use to get ahead? And are we looking at strategy the same way that Federer, the same way that Kobe did, to be able to create advantages in our game? I give a lot of podcast examples, but the examples that I have are the most useful to me. So an example would be related to this podcast. I obviously love doing the research. I'm willing to sit down and read these books. Fortunately, I work in sports. I'm very grateful I have good connections there. That allows me to interview great guests, to take the things that we learn in these deep dives further. Those are two strengths that I have, and hopefully I'm leveraging them as effectively as possible to give you all the most well-researched and detailed information on these athletes or how to improve yourself. So it's about taking, again, what you have and turning that into the most valuable output that you can possibly put together. I also think we should ask us all to think about how much variety we have, how much breadth we have in our talent. Are we a specialist? Which is fine. You can be very effective as a specialist. But if you're not a specialist and you do have breadth, how can you leverage that in the most effective way to get the most out of your game? What two things can you combine to make something great? For example, Kobe had great footwork and he already was quick. That made him appear even faster. That allowed him to get even more space. What things can we combine in our life, in our game, in our mindset that give us a compounding effect? In order to get these compounding effects, we do have to look maybe at the more technical details of what we're good at, what our strengths and our weaknesses are, and how our equipment fits into that. This next section is focused on the technical details of Roger's game relating to his forehand, his backhand, his service, as well as his approach to leveling up his technology. So I think the technical details are what enable all of the tactics that we described. There's aspects of fundamentals that we talked about with Kobe, the footwork and things along these lines. And it's important for us to understand how the technical shot making, the technical footwork, I also lumped in actual technology in here, play together and can line up with the tactics that we choose. I could have put this first, but I honestly thought the strategy and tactics section was a little bit more compelling to give us context on this. So the first thing I'd wonder is, can we generalize fundamentals to all sports? What actions do we take to build that in? This is Agassi before the final. The challenge is really simple. Most people have a weakness, and most people only have one great shot. Federer doesn't have weaknesses, and he has a few great shots. So that equates to a problem. So if you're thinking about the skill development that Roger had, how is he able to, one, create multiple great shots, and how does he eliminate the weaknesses? I would argue that the fundamentals are what allows Roger to limit how many weaknesses he has. If he has really good footwork, if he works on some of these core skills, that limits how much downside he has on these other things. The core things like agility, footwork, hand-eye coordination, they mitigate a lot of the downsides that you have. So if we're building out this core set, and then we're also adding in skill aspects like a forehand and a backhand, that maximizes our overall performance. Stroke technique and footwork have had to be adjusted to deal with the speed, but Federer still seemed to have the time he needed to put the final coat of paint on all his shots. How could he play that way and still recover before hitting the next polished stroke? Because of rare vision, mobility, and agility, but also because of a relatively compact stroke and the confidence that came with knowing that while others had to plan and grind and press, he could conjure solutions on the run or full stretch that others simply lacked the toolkit or Swiss Army knife to create. So that is a far more concrete example of what I just described. He has vision, mobility, and agility. Those are all things you can work on to build out your core. He also has worked to make his strokes compact that gives him even more time. All of these things combined together that he's worked on before to give him confidence over time. Roddick didn't mention the forehand first. He talked about Federer's backhand chip. It felt like it was almost rotating backwards by the time it got to you. So unless you actually made great contact with it, it could kind of go dead on you, Roddick explained. It was a different type of chip. You couldn't just meet it front on. There was some work to do. Tim Henman would stick his chip, and it was hard. Same with Pete. It came through firm. Rogers could come in slow, and then it would just check in a weird way, and you couldn't really go after it. So there's nuance within even the shots that he hits. They're different than his opponents. Working on developing specific shots is another aspect of the technical details. Agassi called Federer one of the greatest target servers with his formidable ability to hit corners and lines, even on big points. So what type of server are you going to be? Are you going to be a power server like Roddick? Or are you going to be a target server? Are you going to be a mix of these things? What defines your game? And then how does that fit into the tactics you use? I'm going to go very lightly into his serve and volley game, his forehand and his backhand. And then we're going to dive more into the fundamentals of his footwork as well as how his equipment complemented what he did. Gilbert, one of the game's best tacticians, noticed Federer's serve improving, getting even more precise and difficult to read. He noticed his returning become more consistent, even though his return position was tight to the baseline rather than deeper in the court like some of his rivals. He got so many returns into play from there like Andre, Gilbert said, referring to Agassi, but Fed didn't crush it. He just poked so many back in play. Floating deep returns into play would not have worked in the serve and volley era when net rushers would have knocked such returns away for winners. But fewer men were serving and volleying at that stage, including Federer. It was a matter of reading the trends and adjusting. So Roger is adjusting not just his style of play, but also the technique that he uses to the game and to the players. And the game is evolving, so he's adapting his game to it. By 2005 and 2006, he was the greatest I've ever seen at just hitting the spot with a serve and then on the next ball. He could just hurt you everywhere, Gilbert said. That for me is what dramatically improved, that ability to get so many free 1-2 points. That took him into a whole nother stratosphere. And that's what gave Roddick more problems than anything. Federer explained to me that the mid-court forehand was, in a sense, a contemporary version of serve and volley. Before, it was about being at the net, but today, it's when you get that mid-court ball after the serve, you better take advantage of it. Otherwise, you pay the price, he said. So part of hitting a good first shot is how the second shot comes in and how you prepare for that. I believe it's a technique and a tactical thing to be able to play the second shot off the serve points really effectively. So he's essentially hitting a really good serve. Rather than getting an ace, the person is serving up a weak return, and then that weak return is being hit for a winner as well. So the serve is as much about getting aces and getting it past the people as the setup for the next point. That might be obvious to tennis people, but I think for other athletes, we need to think about what is the next action and what is the technique associated with that. Now let's look at Federer's forehand. Grovenveld, concerned about Federer's low margin for error on his ground strokes, tried stringing a rope 3 feet above the net and having Federer clear the rope with his shots while still keeping the ball in play. Tremendous topspin was required, and though Federer got the message, in typical fashion, he also took the exercise to the next level, finding a way to marry massive spin and velocity. The forehand he learned to hit at full rip was dubbed the cliffhanger. So he has a very unique shot. We talk about Rafa's shot, his forehand as well. He can hit with a ton of spin that has a ton of bounce. Dorochenko said he often spoke with Peter Carter about Federer's game. One of Dorochenko's areas of interest is laterality, the dominance of one side of the brain in controlling bodily functions. He's particularly focused on eye dominance and how it might impact a player. For Dorochenko, it meant that Federer's most natural shot was his forehand because his shoulders turned, his dominant left eye could track the ball from an advanced position. So there's also our physiology our habits, how things have been ingrained, our eye dominance that play into what works well for us. If Roger is going to be more effective at hitting his forehand because of his eye dominance, if that's something that is given or developed, that's something he should take into consideration as well. Pete Sampras, meanwhile, describes Federer's forehand as the greatest shot in the game over the past 10 years or so. It's especially wicked when Roger takes control of a point. He hits the forehand hard with pace and spin. He can flatten it out when he wants to. It's just a shot that he has so much confidence in, as he should do. He's always had great technique, and he took that and developed it into a great shot. The videographer John Yandel has identified at least 27 different forehands that Federer hits, which is considerably more than any other player. Tony Nadal, Rafa's coach, believes that Federer's forehand is the best in the world, even better than his nephew's. Roger has very high control with his forehand, which can hit the ball low or high, and he can play with spin or flat. That's what makes his forehand dangerous, is that it can produce a winner from anywhere on the court. There's nowhere where you think you're safe. So the technical side of this is Federer has, maybe not consciously, 27 different tools with just his forehand. We talked about the variety that he had earlier, but the fact that he's working on these different shots, he's trying them, he's experimenting in practice, gives him an unbelievable amount of variety in how he chooses his strategy. It also is intimidating for any opponent to think, oh, he just did that before. When is he ever going to pull that again? Roger doesn't even have to hit certain shots. Just the knowledge that he can hit them can be psychologically demanding for the opponent. Now let's look at Roger's backhand. So this is an area we've discussed as a major construction project compared to other areas of his game. If Roger had been two-handed, he would have won fewer majors, not more, said the analyst Craig O'Shaughnessy. You look at the greatest volleyers in the history of the game, and they all have one common denominator. They have a one-handed backhand. When you come to the net to volley, the most important thing is getting the grip right. If you have a one-handed backhand, you don't have to think about your grip when you hit the first volley. You also find it easier to get the angle of the racket right. It stays constant. Okay, so he's not Agassi bashing away his backhand from the back of the court, but Roger's backhands are so much better. The one-handed backhand worked in his game. There are benefits for a style of play where you're at the baseline hitting these two-handed backhands. But it's interesting to see Roger's own perspective on the one-handed backhand. He says, of course, the one-handed backhand will disappear. I can't think of one very good young player on the way up who has a one-handed backhand. As Federer says, the single-handed backhand isn't the future. To me, that's interesting. Federer is doing one thing, but he's saying another thing. Perhaps it's too difficult to follow the path that Roger is doing, and the type of player that Roger became wouldn't happen today because the competition is different. So what I'm trying to say is that where Roger had these growing pains younger, adapting to the shot variety and all these things, maybe someone wouldn't have as much ability to grow at that stage, to be able to get stronger and to physically compete with the one-handed backhand compared to someone using a two-handed backhand at this day and age. So I think that take is particularly interesting. I don't know if there's anything necessarily deeper than that. I'm sure that what happened to Peter was something that inspired him to want to go out and do better. But as I mentioned earlier, him working on his backhand and getting a better backhand was the difference between him being a good tennis player and a great tennis player. And he spent a lot of time doing that and fixing that. So that goes to the dedication that Roger has to work on the areas that he is deficient in. We talked about how much he worked on his forehand. He has all these different shots, but the backhand is something that he was willing to go into and to develop as well. The footwork is also something I hear over and over again. What you do with your feet dictates so many things. We talked with Shane Battier on the podcast a while ago, and he talked about how when he started in the right place, he was able to get much better results on defense. And footwork is something that helps us start in the right place, helps us get to the right place. Getting there and being in the right position is half the battle in a lot of sports. So Roger's able to do a lot of things, said Paganini. He's very coordinated. He moves unbelievably well. And that means that he tries to do more because his game is very rich. If you have more complexity in your game, there's also more complexity to your footwork. Roger's able to do this look as though he's gliding, as he has unbelievable potential. He feels the game well, and if you do that, you have a creative game. From a young age, you learn to move the way that allows you to play this kind of game and be a smart, intelligent player. So Roger has to upgrade his footwork to match the strokes that he can hit to play this different type of game. So it's a little bit demanding, incredibly demanding for him to play the style that he does because there's so many different areas that he has to work on. That is one of the true skills of Roger, is that if he didn't have this foundation of footwork, he wouldn't be able to play the style of play that he does because he wouldn't be able to get all over the court how he does. Footwork specialist David Bailey has identified 15 different moves that tennis players make. If there are any other players, aside from Federer, who can perform all 15, there are not many of them. Roger's movement is difficult to teach and difficult to copy, said Bailey, but oh, so beautiful to watch. Roger's movement is unbelievable. He takes so much time away from you during points. There are balls that you think will just come back to you as a rally ball, and then Roger gets behind it and takes the ball early. That makes it so tough against him. Of course, it's important for everyone to move well, but it's such a fundamental part of his game. It's such a big thing for him, taking time away from the opponent. It means that he gets you moving before you can get him moving. Again, this compounding advantage. He's already quick. He's also able to use such good footwork to get to everything. The important point with Pierre was always the quality of the footwork. You had to be precise with where you put your feet. Tex Winter, a lot of these different great coaches stressed the foundations of footwork. We should all work on our footwork in whatever sport we're playing. I'm going to try to get a footwork expert on to talk about what that means, what the fundamentals are of that, because that's something that's relatively new to me. The sports that I played, footwork was not as practical or meant a little bit less, especially relating to golf. And I'm interested if there's elements of that I could pull into any of the sports that I play. The second and last thing I want to focus on in terms of technical details are equipment. So we talked about in the last section how Roger upgraded to a larger racket head. And a lot of people were curious why he didn't do that before. So making a technology change can be a big endeavor. And a lot of people don't necessarily think about the implications of changing technology. What does that mean? What are the benefits or the drawbacks? So to me, this is a really good deep dive into one, how technology can help us, two, how hard it can be to adjust from technology, especially if you've been using it for a long time, and three, how Roger went through and made that decision. And also the detail that Roger goes into around the technology that he uses. Late every evening during tournaments, usually after he's returned from dinner, Roger Federer composes a text message. Contained in the message, which he'll ping to his racket stringer, are 2 or 3 numbers, the tensions he selected for his match the next day. Those tensions, expressed in kilograms, will determine Federer's ability to play the tennis he wants. Let those numbers also stand as examples of the detail that goes into Federer's preparation. For each match at a Grand Slam, Federer will take 8 or 9 rackets on court, strung at the tensions he's chosen, rising for greater control and dipping for more power. Much thought goes into that message. Half a kilogram here or there could be the difference between victory and defeat. The question that Roger will be asking himself before he sends that message is, how are the balls flying? Said Nate Ferguson, whose company P1 or Priority One has been looking after Federer's rackets for more than a decade. So Roger is spending this much time on the details of his equipment. We talked about how Tiger was so anal about his equipment, he could tell if a driver was just 2 grams off by picking it up. The weight of a single dollar bill. The attention to detail in the equipment, in our practice, in our routine, all these types of things, they pay dividends over time. I'm sure there's something about what we're doing in our sport where we're not paying as much attention to detail where we could be, and all of the details, they really add up. For example, let's say I'm playing golf and I didn't check my ball and I scuffed it on the last hole. Either I hit like a really crisp wedge and I took some of the cover off, or it hit a tree or the cart path, which is more likely. Just that little nick in the ball can change the spin characteristics of the next shot that I hit. So it's really important for me to evaluate that and hopefully just switch the equipment out or make adjustments that are relevant. Something we see in golf, for example, in team events, is that you can choose what ball you use on the tee and alternate shot. So maybe it's better to use a specific ball on a specific hole because one, the players are more comfortable with it, or different balls have different characteristics, and you can create a little bit of advantage if you're using something different that lines up with the hole or the wind patterns or anything along those lines. Whether the balls are flying or not depends on the surface, the altitude, and also the ball manufacturer. Sometimes they fluff up quickly, and those become slow balls, dead balls. Then we look at the match conditions. the opponent, and the weather. The higher the temperature, the more the ball flies. The higher the altitude, the thinner the air, the more the ball flies. All these factors combine to make it a heavy ball, a normal ball, or a fast ball. Based on that, he'll decide the tensions that he wants. So as I was describing, I was thinking about how golf balls can not detriment me. Roger is thinking about how he can get an advantage or how he can match the equipment to the conditions that he's facing. To me, this is, again, the second order thinking that the elite athletes do so well. For another example of the patterns of order that help to shape Federer's existence, above his serving patterns and the way he deploys his forehand, consider how he switches his racket at every ball change. That is, after the opening 7 games of a match, from then on after every 9 games. However, it's not quite as simple as that. The exact timing of the swap depends on whether Federer is about to serve, in which case the switch will come on a game before or a game after the ball change. He does not want to be adjusting to both new balls and new strings at the same time. On top of everything else that's happening in the match, Ferguson said, Federer is keeping track of those numbers when no one else is. To think about that, this to me is mind-boggling how much detail he goes into, how much he cares, how much he's keeping track of. But this is all to just get a very small advantage, a very small thing that, again, will add up to help him. There's a little theater in the moment Federer unsheaths the racket from the plastic bag stamped with the Roger Federer logo. Each of the bags has a sticker attached so Federer can find the racket he wants easily. Applying these logos and stickers is just one small part of the process in preparing Federer's rackets, with each stamp taking around a half hour. So the guy I described before who does all Federer's rackets, Ferguson, he was the stringer for Sampras, and he clearly is detail-oriented, cares about what he does. Another way that Roger is outsourcing slightly, but setting a really high standard for what he does. This, to me, based on Roger's personality, what we're hearing about him, how relaxed he is, it's something probably a lot of people don't realize how anal he is about. And the devil is 100% in the details. We saw that in Tiger. We saw that in Kobe. We're now seeing it in Roger, even though on the surface, it seems like he might not care that much about that. Let's look into the story of how Roger went about his racket change. The story of how Roger Federer came to switch to a larger racket is one littered with more than 100 prototypes, maybe even double that number, as according to some technicians at Wilson, the Chicago-based company who supply Federer's rackets, there are more than 250 different versions of the new frame under development. I remember working for a year and a half trying to develop a racket with Pete Sampras, and he just kept wanting the new racket to play exactly like the old racket. Roger, though, enjoyed the process of testing different rackets and working with Wilson to find a racket that would improve his game and give him easier power. Pete had all the power in the world, and he was all about controlling that power with his racket. Roger realized he needed to add power to keep up with the speed of today's tennis. So Roger is viewing the racket in multiple different ways. He's trying to use the racket to evolve with the game. He's also trying to find something that he likes, and balancing those forces is a powerful thing. I've talked a lot about teetering the line and balancing between two things. In my mind, that's one of the things that Roger and other great athletes do really well, is they realize they have to find the middle ground for what works for them, and they do a great job of teetering that line effectively. For the best part of a decade, he didn't go any bigger than that. His rivals were enlarging their rackets to give them more power and a bigger sweet spot, but Federer kept it old school. It was not as if he'd not been thinking about it, though. He was not deaf to the science or the advances in technology. For a while, some had been urging Federer to experiment with a larger frame, which would be more forgiving at the moments when the ball did not connect with the middle of the strings. For all his talent, Federer had always shanked more shots than his rivals. Sampras, who had struck with that 85 square inch racket throughout his career, but changed to a large frame to play exhibition matches in retirement, has since expressed regret that he did not so earlier in his heyday. So what's important here is it's not that Federer is ignoring the technology. It's not that Federer doesn't want to upgrade it. It's that he wants it to be right when he does it. I think Federer is an innovator in a bunch of different ways, and it's surprising that he's not innovating on the racket right away. But if you think about when he would make the racket change and how long that would take, that could derail a large portion of his career, and he has to balance that with the potential advances that come with that. And he also looked at Sampras, who didn't make the change, and he realized that he probably should, because he was talking to Sampras a lot, how they were, we talked about how they're good friends. Federer made a permanent switch to a larger frame at the conclusion of his disappointing 2013. The racket would become known as the Wilson Pro Staff RF97 Autograph, with the number a reference to its square inches. It was a bold move, but it was also a smart, calculated, and eminently sensible one. His surge in form in 2014 underlines that. Every part of Federer's game was altered by the change. He believes that the new racket produced an increase in power and also gave him an improvement in his first serve percentage. So every part of his game was influenced by the racket. Think about the amount of change that he has to go through when changing rackets than someone else. He has more variety than anyone else in the game. A new racket means he has to essentially reevaluate all of that variety, which is probably harder than someone whose game is more one-dimensional. Roger now had more speed with his backhand, especially when hitting down the line, Laver explained. Since moving to that new racket, he's been hitting the ball harder and more aggressive. Roger's able to positively augment his game, though, even though he has to adjust and reevaluate some things. Roger said himself, so this was, I believe, in 2007. I found this on a Reddit AMA with Roger Federer. Maybe it was a little later than that, but he said, I've been testing rackets for the last 10 years and have also tested a 95 square inch one, so who knows? Maybe one day I'll always be open for changes. The real challenge is finding a time in the calendar year where I have enough time to test it out and get comfortable. So to me, that's a really telling thing. The innovation is always on Roger's mind. It's, again, the balancing between innovation and sustaining play that he has to evaluate. So what are the outcomes of the equipment change? The new racket is, in theory, a 97 hoop model, although that information should be taken with a grain of salt. Many of the great tennis players use prototypes. Rackets made to measure for Federer's, according to the people who are close to him, might have a couple inches more or less than the official model. It's a unique racket which exists only for him. It's not sold in any stores. Whatever the design, it's the racket he needed. Ever since he started playing with it, Federer noticeably improved the power and the effectiveness of his serve, as well as his backhand, which is much more solid with more topspin when he needs it. So the equipment, it fits together with the tactics, it fits together with his play style, it fits together with everything. And I believe one of the reasons why he was able to come back and have success against Rafa in 2017 and 2018 is he made this change and was able to adapt and dramatically improve his backhand. The last thing I want to touch on with Roger and the approach he takes are related to analytics and how he prepares pre and post match. So it's not just that there are technical elements of these areas of his game. Analytics can help inform where he can improve. And Rafa did say in one of the things I saw that neither him nor Federer did a ton of analytics. I think that might be the case, but you always need a baseline and a feedback. And I think that the evidence to me suggests that he at least used that in some way. So this is when Roger did not have a coach after he let go of Peter Lundgren. And he went without a coach for a couple of years. And he won a lot. At those times, perhaps the closest person he had to a coach was whichever IBM employee happened to hand him a sheet of match statistics when he came off the court. The whisper in the locker room was that Federer could look at those numbers and then make all the tweaks required next time. The reality, though, is he could have done that without the data. He found that after a few matches against an opponent, it barely took him a few minutes to decide on a game plan for their next encounter. So why pay someone to complicate his thinking when he was perfectly capable of solving the riddles, as he put it, on his own? And even when Federer did link up with coaches, they were not with him for 40 weeks a year like Peter Lundgren had been. This is also Paul Annacone on his pre-match planning. I think it's important to evaluate that as well.
Originally, when Roger and I were together, we did a lot of video stuff. We watched a lot of different matches that he had played, successes and failures in hotel rooms, and then talked about that and discussed things. So he was more into the process of hearing ideas, seeing ideas. Pete was really locked into, okay, this is how I play. He knew how he played, knew his game really well. How do I plug that in tomorrow against X?
To me, those are technical things, not necessarily strategic things, because you can have diagnostics based on how you perform and you evaluate the single individual areas of your game. You can also use data and planning strategically as well. And this could probably have gone in either section. So before we go on to how we viewed competition, I would pose the questions to all of us. So how do we view our fundamentals? What are the fundamentals of our sport? So in golf, the fundamentals are maybe having a go-to shot. In jiu-jitsu, for example, the fundamentals are probably being able to play in close guard retention, developing some semblance of moving and shrimping. In tennis, in basketball, and a lot of these sports, footwork is one of the fundamentals. How do we build those and leverage those and practice those and build up the stamina and skill to maximize those? Are you also getting compounding effects between the fundamentals that you have, the technique that you use, and the strategy that you use? And then finally, other tools that we could leverage, like data, for example, like feedback devices like an Aura Ring or a Whoop. To me, fitting these all together can give us really cool advancements over time. The next section we're going to focus on is competition. So Federer had a very unique view of competition, and I think this relatively healthy view of competition is something that gave him, one, an advantage, but also pushed his career and his level of tennis further than anything else. When it comes to competition, I think Federer viewed it in a very interesting way. We talked about how Kobe and Tiger, they relished the challenge, but it wasn't necessarily about the competition for them. It was about how they could push themselves further. Who they were playing against didn't matter. They were all beneath them. For Roger, it's very different. For tennis, it's this individual sport where you're playing these head-to-head matchups. And I really like how he viewed his opponents. Federer endured so long that he had to cope with his records being broken before he retired. It was a poignant development, and I asked him about it once. As much as I like the records, to break them or own them, I guess for me it's really about the breaking part, which is beautiful, not the owning part, he said. Because no one can take away that moment. All the records are there to be broken anyway at one point. But the first moment when you take that step or that leap into the sphere where nobody has been before, that's really inspiring. Pecci was also struck by how Federer improved with age, long beyond the time when most people are long gone as a threat to win the biggest tournaments. His longevity had broken the mold, showing the way for Nadal, Djokovic, and others. I really love how Roger is approaching this. He will always have the idea that he broke the records, but he also appreciates that other people are going to break them before him. To me, that's a really healthy way of looking at these things. It's not sad for him that someone else has broken what he's done. That doesn't take away from the thing that he's done before. I think many articles will separate Novak or Rafa from Roger because Roger is the one that started it. Novak should thank Roger, and he should thank Rafa, because Rafa said, wait a minute, what Roger can do, I can do too. And then Novak said, okay, then I can do it too. What Roger has unleashed is unbelievable. No one has moved tennis forward as he has. So Roger is, in my opinion, like the Roger Bannister of tennis. So Roger Bannister is the first person who ran the 4-minute mile. I'd love to do maybe a short episode on him at some point. But after he broke the 4-minute mile, many people did it afterward. There was this psychological block between people and running that distance. They thought physiologically it couldn't be done. Once someone did it, the precedent was there and people blew through that consistently. Both Novak and Rafa have won more major championships than Roger did. But at the time, when Roger got to 20, that was 6 more than Pete Sampras, who had the most major championships in history to that point. So he showed that it was possible. And for him, he was able to really get a lot of enjoyment and value out of that over his career. I still think Roger is one of the greatest tennis players of all time, or if not the greatest of all time, because he was able to set that precedent. He did it without realizing it was possible to begin with, which is a really impressive story overall. Tennis has been blessed with great rivalries throughout history. In the past 40 years alone, we've had Martina Navratilova, Chris Evert, John McEnroe, Bjorn Borg, Stefan Edberg, Boris Becker, Pete Sampras, Andre Agassi, all spurring each other on. Without their main rival, they may never have reached the heights they did. They make each other better, forcing them to improve if they wanted to remain on the top. Without Federer, Nadal may have won more titles, but he would not have needed to improve. Without Djokovic, they each might have won more, but neither would have needed to keep adding things to their game. So Roger realized this. He realized that Rafa, that Djokovic, everyone he's playing against makes him better, and it allows him to get better at pursuing the best version of himself. With Tiger, frankly, there weren't any comparables. Maybe later in his career, Phil Mickelson came along, but Tiger didn't view Phil as on his level. He recognized him as a competitor, but he wasn't using Phil to help push him to become a more complete golfer. That was completely self-driven. Roger's progression and goal to get better is self-driven, but he is able to push off of these other people. He's able to leverage them and have them show what his weaknesses are so he can then work on them. I think that's a really good way to view the people around you, is that, hey, you're helping me get better. Even though you're competing against me, you're an asset to me rather than a distraction or someone I should be worried about or be unfriendly with. Tony Nadal, so Nadal's uncle and coach, was also talking about how the pair depleted each other's reserves of talent. In every way, both had nothing more to give. They had reached the limits of what they or any other tennis players could achieve. Without Nadal around, there was no what ifs for Federer. He was the best he could possibly be. This is Roger on that. In some ways, I believe yes, and in some ways, I believe no, Federer said. I believe that because of Rafa, maybe I achieved less, but at the same time, I feel he made me a better player. So when we think about the greatest athletes of all time, what do they truly care about? Do they care about winning more majors than anyone else? They might want to do that. But what they really care about is being the best possible tennis player or golfer or basketball player they could possibly be. They care about maximizing their entire potential. You look at David Goggins. He has this idea that when you die, you go look at who you could have possibly been, and your life is measured on how close you got to that ideal. I think that athletes at the highest level also view it in a similar way. Roger is realizing that he is actually a better tennis player because of Rafa, even if he won less tournaments. And that might be even more valuable to him than the tournament wins and even the legacy and all these things. He's pushing to see how good he could possibly get. And without Rafa, without Novak, that wasn't necessarily possible to see how far he could come. Roger was also not just focusing on the competition like Rafa and Djokovic, who were at the top. He was constantly pushing himself against other challengers as well. Federer's trained with many young players in Dubai over the years, from Stefanos Tsitsipas, Felix Auger-Aliassime, and more recently, young Swiss star Dominic Stricker. Again, apologize with the names, not my strongest suit. It's an incredible opportunity for young players who get a rare insight into how one of the greatest players of all times practices. It's a two-way street too. The youngsters got to train with Federer and learn how he goes about his job. Federer got to train with eager, young, keen players. So Roger is borrowing their energy. He's seeing how the game is evolving. He is getting a benefit from these people, even though they're benefiting just as much. But Roger has no problem passing down his knowledge to the younger players. That's something that all of the greats we've seen are open to doing. Something Roger maybe has a different view on than, for example, Tiger Woods, is Roger is very respectful of his opponents. So this is at an early age how Federer was always around his opponents and interacting with them. Sometimes they went to a football club Basel match together or watched a movie at home. And on free weekends, they often met at the tennis court and got up to all kinds of mischief. But in official matches, they were dead serious. That's when we no longer knew of friendship, Snyder said. We were both very ambitious, and that showed. It always became very emotional. In the first few matches, it was mainly Federer who got loud and sometimes had a racket slip out of his hands. So Roger was raised and was around people he was competing with all the time. It wasn't weird for them to be friendly and then enemies on the court and then go back to being friends. He keeps that into his entire life, and I think that serves him really well. Roger cried pretty badly at the end of the match, Allegro said, but he cried for like 20 minutes and then it was over. That night we ate dinner together. So that's how Roger is treating these things. There's on the court and off the court, and those things are completely separate for him. The peer spirit we had was very important, Michael Lammer told me. We had great coaches. It was a relaxed atmosphere, but it was important for us younger players that every day you saw the top players in Switzerland practicing from different generations. I think it was a big motivation. They would all push each other at a formative stage, which is often the key to the fortress in tennis. Players cannot become great in isolation. From the Bollettieri Academy in Brendan, Florida in the 1980s, to the clay courts of Barcelona in the 1990s, to the clubs of Moscow in the 2000s, the ability to bring talented youngsters together to test their limits and psyches on a daily basis has proved to be a successful formula. So again, let's contrast this to Tiger Woods, who grew up in a largely solitary, individualized practice routine. At tournaments, he wasn't necessarily friends with the competitors. He was going out to step on their throats, to go and dominate them. Whereas Roger is friends with everyone. He still wants to go out and win, but it's a very different perspective that he's bringing in, especially playing at one of these academies. They showed to people that you could have a very intense rivalry, but at the same time have a good respect. And you can be a friend of your opponent. Normally, this doesn't happen. And with these two guys, it happened, and that was special. So this is on Nadal. Rafa and Roger wildly respect each other. They don't necessarily agree with everything. So Roger and Rafa were both on the ATP council, and they had a falling out about the ideals, but they were still friends. And I think that that's a really important thing, is that if you can differentiate those things, that means you could probably differentiate on the court. And that means that you can also probably compartmentalize or differentiate across other areas of your life, which to an athlete is very powerful. Roger would also make a habit of inviting opponents to practice. Interestingly, Stakhovsky and Federer met again the following month in Hamburg, and rather than holding a grudge after being defeated, Federer invited him to practice. We chatted a lot, he said. We were both on the ATP Player Council at the time, and I couldn't say that anything changed after I beat him. Maybe we practiced a bit more because I was more on the favorable side with him. So Roger is turning a loss to someone into a win. He's learning how to not lose to them again in practice, but he's also able to leverage a new training partner. He doesn't have a grudge or thin skin about being defeated. And I think that that's really important. Another good example of this is his relationship with Leighton Hewitt. Again, they were coming out at the same time. They were rivals. It wasn't that they hated each other, but they had these heated matches earlier in their career. And off the court, they became really good friends. They do a lot of things together. And they were also just still tough competitors when they would play against each other. Just like how Kobe and Tiger get better with a challenge, Roger also loved to compete, without a doubt. The Federer we see on the court today is a manufactured product of Nike's marketing that represents the values we want to give tennis. The gentleman and all that, he told me. But deep inside, Federer was never a gentleman. He's a fighter, and when he extends the hand with a smile to Nadal, I'm not all that convinced. So Roger still has teeth under all of this. He still has the ability to pull it out and not necessarily hate his opponents, but want to win and do anything to win. And I love how well he can compartmentalize these things. And it plays to his advantage to be able to do this. The guy's a master, said Peter Lundgren. I'll never forget when he bought the James Bond Nintendo game. And we went to some tournament and he had to go through a gate in the game. And he called me and said, Peter, I can't get through this stupid gate. And I said, why are you calling me? I have no clue. And then he calls me an hour later and he goes, yes, I did it. He finished the whole game in one day. And it would take a normal person maybe a month. The guy is scary when it comes to games. That's something you're born with, the ability to solve problems. And very often when he was under pressure in matches, when he was the mouse and the other guy was the cat, he found a hole to escape and survive. So Roger has this persistence from an early age. I again would disagree that that was God-given. I think that that's something Roger developed. He is willing to sit and compete and push himself even in the face of adversity. And that's a characteristic, this persistence, that I think is really important. One of the many reasons to admire Federer is his stubbornness when his backhand has come under attack. He does not retreat. Instead, he stays just where he is and continues to take big swings at the ball, even if he shanks a few. If you have a one-handed backhand, Federer has said, it's so natural to play the slice that you almost have to tell yourself to stay on the front foot and be aggressive. Let's think about any other athlete we've talked about in the past. You have to be fully committed to what you're doing. You recognize that you're going to fail sometimes. It's a difficult shot to execute, but when you execute it, it's worth it, and your percentage is higher than if you were to hit those slice backhands for Roger. You look at Kobe, who is playing against the best players in the world, and he realizes he's going to look foolish sometimes because he's playing against the best guys. That's a natural part of the sport. You can't dwell on it. I remember when the draw came out, I thought to myself, oh God, I could play Pete Sampras in the fourth round. That was a little stressful for me. It was a nice stress though, Federer said. It was my first appearance on center court, and I was going to play against one of my heroes. So Roger is framing stress as good stress. It's anticipation, not anxiety, something we've talked about in the past, labeling the physical phenomenon that we're facing because it's the same in stress as in anticipation. Ultimately, what enabled Federer to spend all those weeks at number one was his desire to compete. Being ranked number one for more than 300 weeks, that's testimony to how much he enjoys playing week in and week out. To see the expression on his face when he wins a smaller tournament, that shows just how much he loves to play and win, Annacone said. And as Federer once exclaimed, it's fantastic. I recommend winning to everyone. So he loves to play, he loves to win, but I would argue and say he loves playing as much as he loves winning. And winning is a byproduct of having fun playing and putting your best foot forward and all of the other work that goes into that. And so it all is very continuous with Roger. He loves the whole process from beginning to end. And that to me is one of the greatest skills in all of tennis. The last thing that I think is really interesting is that Roger goes out of his way and is willing to root for his opponents. I think that that is unbelievable. Roger says, "Quite impressive, isn't it? He's already bigger than me, and he's 5 years younger. Imagine how he looks in 5 years. It's good for tennis that you've got these different types of guys and players, but at 18, 19, I was nothing like that." He's hyping up Rafa. He's talking about how big he's going to be for the game. Roger is able to look at this big picture of how good performances are for tennis. Something that we saw when he lost in 2008 is that it felt like the end of the world for him when he lost to Rafa at Wimbledon. It ended his 5-win streak at the tournament. It was a low point for him, but after a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, he realizes that maybe that's the best possible thing for tennis, to see one of the greatest matches, if not the greatest match of all time, and get so many people interested in the sport. That is better for him in the long run. If he handles that gracefully, that gives him even more of an advantage of all time. That makes him endeared to the fans. It was all classic Federer, friendly with his competitors, but also ruthlessly able to switch off the charm with the ball in play and focus entirely on the challenge. So again, there's this compartmentalization. He's able to turn it off and on, and that's something he's cultivated clearly over time. And that's something he does better than other people, because not everyone can turn it off and on like he does. And we'll touch about that in the next section. Kind of summing up this section, who are your valued competitors? How do you feel about them? Are you cutthroat? Are you not studying them? Are you thinking they're beneath you? If that's the case, might be useful to have a paradigm shift to understand what you could learn from them. How are they pushing you? Be grateful for the people that you're competing against. When you go into a gym anywhere, the people you're practicing with, your teammates, you're grateful for how they improve you, how they find inefficiencies of your game. I don't see it any different to be able to view your opponents like that. It is important, though, to make sure that when you're in game time, you're able to turn that off and you're not going to give them any extra wiggle room because they helped you in some way. You don't necessarily have to love your opponents, but you 100% can learn from them and they can help push you towards greatness. The next section is on reputation. This, in my mind, is the single most interesting advantage that Roger Federer has, that very few other people have cultivated or could even possibly cultivate. So how did Roger Federer make his reputation one of the most valuable advantages in sports? I think where Roger was very clever, and I don't know if it was him actually thinking about it or if it's just his natural demeanor, but he's very well liked across the board by virtually everyone. And I think it helped him. I think for a long period of time, people didn't hate him enough and didn't find enough in him that they didn't like, so that they wouldn't go out there with that extra 5% and try to beat him. Again, this is one of the most unique advantages in sport. He's so nice that people don't necessarily want to turn it up against him, or subconsciously, they can't really bring themselves to do it. This is similar to the Tiger effect, where everyone is overwhelmed by how good Tiger was. But there's another angle here where Roger, yes, he plays beautiful tennis. He's graceful. He never looks tired, but you also just like him. He's a nice guy. He's done stuff for you as an athlete. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. There's also his reputation that is framed by the media, which is really important to evaluate. So let's first think about what his relationship with the media is and how he cultivated that. He advised me to inform the most important Swiss journalists beforehand and give them interviews. Maybe one of the articles would open a door for me for a life after my career if someone read it. So that's what I did. So Roger, right out of the gate, when he turns pro, he organizes relationships and contacts all of the Swiss media to get relationships with them, and again, to say that he's going pro and tell a story. So he started that relationship in a strong way early, and he continued that over time. Roger set his boundaries with the media very clearly. He said, hey, this is what I'm going to do with you. I'll be very authentic. I'll be there and present. I'll give you my time. But there's also these private angles that I don't want you to be a part of. He did a great job at keeping those separate, and he was able to build a respect with the media that few athletes I've seen have done as well. No sportsman is interviewed as much as Federer. The ability to speak 4 languages, English, German, Swiss German, and French, means his post-match media commitments at Grand Slam tournaments can last an hour or more for a routine match. and up to 3 or 4 hours if he wins the tournament. Roger also takes pride in being himself, and I think that this has really helped him over the course of his career. You see, for example, Tiger Woods now being a lot more himself and letting himself out a little bit in the media, and he's very well liked at this stage in his career. It wasn't always like that. For me, this is a bit exaggerated, to be honest, he said. I don't care especially about making sure that everything is perfect or whatever. It is what it is, and I don't think you should try overly crazy to protect your image. It should happen naturally, and that's the approach I've had. If people love you, they love you, he added. If they don't, they don't. I'm not going to change my character to please everyone because I know everyone won't be pleased. And I know they shouldn't be because there are plenty of other characters out there and other athletes. So I just think the natural way with the media and the fans was the way for me to go. I'm happy I can speak so openly and honestly to everyone without being too controversial, but I guess I try to be interesting for the fans because I want them to read a good story instead of all the controversies. So Roger has, I think, a very mature and logical approach to this is there's going to be people that love you. There's going to be people that hate you. You can only control what you control. And this is something I see a lot in podcasting. So you hear on the Joe Rogan podcast, he basically never reads the criticism from people online. That can be a detriment in some sense. You're not getting real feedback, but there's always going to be people, if you have a large enough audience, who are not going to like you, who are going to say bad things, who are going to try to do bad things to you. And if you realize that's just a part of a normal distribution, there's going to be normal people, there's going to be crazy people, there's going to be everyone across the way with enough volume, you sort of have to take everything with a grain of salt. This is an example of how the media talks about him, and you have to think about the impact that this has on his competition. For those of you who wonder what it is to be in the zone, you saw it today. He said before turning to Federer, Roger, you're living proof that this game is easy. You made it look easy. I never saw anyone do it as smoothly. So you think about playing against Roger, you hear how the media is talking about him. He's this larger than life person. He's making the game easy. He's doing things no one can do that are seemingly impossible. It starts to get in your head a little bit, especially if you're hearing it from a bunch of different angles. One thing I liked that Roger did, he's spending so much time with the media. He made it work for him. So it wasn't drudgery, it wasn't work. He viewed the media time, or he framed the media time to himself as therapy. This to me is not something I've really ever seen anyone else do. And this is an incredible mental advantage that he has. He can recharge, he can decompress by talking to the press. Answering questions in 3 or 4 languages, Federer also uses press conferences as part of his warm down, almost in a cathartic way. By the time he's done talking, win or lose, the match is out of his system. He even asks his coaches occasionally to watch his press conferences so that they know what's going on in his head. Really efficient use of time. Yet, though a large percentage of them may have been similar, he's always found a way to be thoughtful and offer an interesting answer. What's more, he even learned to use them for his own purposes, getting matches out of his system faster than he might have otherwise done. So again, reiterating that same point, he is able to essentially do some talk therapy to process the match verbally through these interviews. How many people are too wrapped up in them or don't want to talk about them and are just frustrated at being with the media and having to do this? This paradigm shift for Roger is maybe delusional, but also probably something that allows him to not waste time in these media outings compared to his opponents. Also, how different is this than, for example, Tiger, who dreaded being there, never gave the media anything, always wanted the interviews to be done. Again, that's his right to do it. He was someone that had way too much undue media pressure on him that for a normal person or for anyone, it could be stressful. But I really love how Federer took that energy and made it his own. So we talked a little bit before about the perception of the other players. What are the implications of Roger's reputation on them? I don't even remember where it was, Smith said. We were sitting on a wall somewhere, and I hear Leighton mumbling. This is Leighton Hewitt. And then I realize he's saying, he's too quick. And I said to him, who's too quick? And Leighton said, Roger's too quick. And at that stage, everyone in the world thought Leighton was the fastest thing that had ever moved on a tennis court, Smith said. But he looked up at me and said, he's that quick. No one knows it, but he's that quick. he has these opponents muttering under their breath about how fast he is, how good he is, how unbeatable he is. That to me is a pretty incredible mental advantage. But this is being reinforced constantly by the media. This is being reinforced constantly by watching Roger in the clubhouse, how relaxed he is, and these types of things. This even affects Nadal, who I believe ended with a pretty good winning record over Roger, up until the point late in his career where Roger turned it around. Another fiction, and this is one which Rafa Nadal appears to have bought into, describing Federer as a blessed freak of nature, is the Swiss has never had to work hard at the physical side of tennis. Actually, I've had to push and mold my body to adapt it to cope with the repetitive muscle stress that tennis forces on you. But Federer just seems to have been born to play the game. His physique, his DNA, seems perfectly adapted to tennis, Nadal wrote in his autobiography. They tell me he doesn't train as hard as I do. I don't know if it's true, but it would figure. No, it's not positive. Maybe he just has a great physique that he'll finish his career like a rose. Neither I, nor Murray, nor Djokovic will end our careers like roses. We will finish physically affected, unless you're super privileged like him, who has an ease, and I don't doubt his efforts, but for him the game comes easy. The rest of us all have to put in just a bit more effort than he does when we physically wear our bodies out more than he does. This is a callback to Roger not showing emotion or fatigue on the court. It looks easy. It seems like he's not stressed. This is something he has cultivated. Of course, maybe it's true. Maybe his physique is different. But based on what I've learned about the science of recovery, the science of physiology, I would argue it's more in the process he uses and the psychology he uses and the media attention to Roger that is creating this aura to the other players that he is playing against. Every time you step on the court with Roger, you feel it's not an ordinary match. There's so much more weight to everything around that match. The anticipation, the rivalry. So of course, it's the ultimate challenge in the sport, playing Roger on grass and Rafa on clay. I said at the time in the wrong way, to beat Roger, you need to beat his ego. It's not his ego, it's his legacy. You don't face just the guy. You face his 20 slams. You face his record breaking. There's so many things you face, and then you have a chance. It's not easy, and you think you're not going to have another chance. So first, the media won't let you forget that Roger is tennis royalty, is one of the greatest all time, the most natural, the most gifted, but also his reputation. You know what he's capable of. And then that ties in so well with how graceful he is, how easy it makes it look. This to me is creating such a comprehensive mental advantage of someone who is seemingly infallible. And the perception of how good someone is can play into how you play against them and how aggressive you are or how intimidated you are. I think up until that point, Roger did carry a bit of a mythical kind of status amongst a lot of players. Even though Andy knew he could, I think Roger at that stage had just a little bit about him that you weren't quite sure if you were capable of competing with him, even the best guys in the world. If you're going to lose to someone, at least you're losing to the best and you're losing to someone that you're also happy for, he said. That's the way I always felt with Andy, you know. If I'm not going to win, I hope he does. And if I'm not going to win and Andy's not going to win, I hope Roger does. He's just that nice of a person. It was frustrating to play him, but what can you do? So he's giving all these other players an out by losing to him. Oh, he's a nice guy. Oh, he's one of the best ever. You start stacking up all these excuses around why someone else could or should beat you, or it's not that bad. That's when you lose every single time. And again, he is giving everyone an out by having this reputation that he does. There's a lot of subtle things that Roger does to cultivate this image. His relationship with the media, how he started that early and cultivated that, how he tries to be private with some of his stuff and very open with some other things. Also, how he is not showing the emotion. He's not showing if he's tired or hurt on the court ever. He also is very relaxed when he's not on the court. And this is something I think that comes very natural to him, but it's also very intimidating to his opponents. You know the nerves that you feel when you're going up for a match or you're playing in a major tournament. Think of any competition that you're in, even the competitions that I do in my mid-age that are a bunch of weekend golfers or weekend jiu-jitsu people, you still get really nervous. And if the other person is looking very calm in that same situation, what does that signal to you? Because we can only feel what we feel. We can only understand what our sensations are. And if other people aren't showing that same physiology or that same response, that cues on to us that something's off. Both those guys are great people. So this is Rafa and Roger. But before the match, Rafa's got his Big Bose headphones on and he's running up and down the locker room, doing the sprints, taping his fingers. He's like a caged animal. And then the next day, I'm playing Roger, and we're talking about his house back in Switzerland, and he's just bought some land, and it's about what he and Mirka are going to do. And it was honestly like we're sitting at a coffee shop as calm as can be. And yet both men, not just Nadal, were remarkable at flipping the switch when it came time for combat and transforming themselves into steely-eyed champions. It was simply that Federer waited until later in the process to make that shift. Nadal's transformation came in the locker room, Federer's on the court. So they're both flipping a switch. They're making a transformation. We talked about what that meant with the alter ego effect or when we're using an alter ego. But think about the different things that these two players are suggesting to their opponents. It can be intimidating to play Rafa 100%. He's so amped up. He's like a caged animal. That probably works the majority of the time. I think that that's an effective tactic to psych out an opponent. Oh my goodness, he's so ready to go, all these things. But Roger's approach also, I think, works equally well. Oh, he's so relaxed. This must not be difficult for him. Oh, it's directly in line with the image that Roger has cultivated, and that's why it works so well. I want to stress in this episode how all of these things fit together, whether it's the technique and the strategy or his laid back approach and his media reputation. It's cohesive, and that's something that I think makes it work really well. We get these compounding effects. Roger's relationship with his competition was also a big part of his repetition as well. So there was a lot of peace. So he did not feud with the other great players. It wasn't like a McEnroe and Connors who were at each other's necks. He was very peaceful and appreciative and gracious to the other players. When asked the same question, Federer made it clear that the peaceful environment hadn't happened by chance, but that it was a deliberate choice. I always thought it best to be nice to the new generations who enter the sport, rather than making them feel like it was going to be hell for them. And I think that spread to Rafa and the other players. Tennis is a hard sport, sure, but ultimately it is a sport. There are many more things in life. So again, if you're playing against Roger and you kind of like the guy, it's a little harder to pull the trigger and bring out your best stuff because you genuinely like him. One of the difficulties for Federer's rivals over the years, John McEnroe once suggested, is that the Swiss is so likable that they found it impossible to fuel themselves for competition with any bitterness or enmity. Federer is a classy guy, and maybe that's the problem, that it's difficult to find anything wrong with him. I don't think there's a guy in the locker room who doesn't like Roger Federer. Imagine that. Being likable, being nice, being a superpower and an advantage. For example, Roger is also going out of his way for Roddick's foundation, for Rafa's tennis camp that he's doing. He's showing up. He's giving 100%. This is late in their careers, but he is willing to do these things for other competitors, which a lot of other people wouldn't go through and do. I think that that's pretty amazing. He's pleasant. He's nice to everyone. And it's just really refreshing to see. And it makes it difficult, honestly, for everyone else to compete with that. Because you look and there's so many excuses. He's number one in the world. He's got to be arrogant. He's got to be kind of a jerk. He doesn't have time to do this. Somehow Roger makes time for everyone. It's really incredible. I think he probably does this because he's genuinely a nice guy. It'd probably be exhausting to do this if he didn't enjoy it. But I'm sure there's some cohort of us who really enjoy doing these types of things, really enjoy building these relationships with other people and pushing you both forward. And if that's the case, you like that type of thing, I would hopefully put myself in that category. It is a way you can get an advantage and just lean into it. I think that that's really awesome. Another thing that Roger did for all tennis players is he was on the ATP Council for quite a long time, and he was advocating for everyone across the board to have higher pay. So he also brought a lot of interest into the sport, very much like Tiger Woods, and was able to get people more money for the events because of his good play. It makes a lot of difference when he's negotiating or he's making a case. He was essential in terms of prize money increases. We were going through this topic for a number of years. We had a pretty harsh time, and we had a very good, solid background of the players who were willing to do something about it. And yet, if it hadn't been for Roger and Rafa Nadal, I doubt we would have been able to push it. The minute we got more funds committed to the players, his first comment was, okay, now this money has to go down. It has to go through the qualifiers to the first round players for a better life for them. We're okay at the top. It doesn't need to be here. So it was a selfless act in which he had put in a lot of work. For instance, in the 2021 US Open, first round prize money was $75,000. If we look back 10 years ago, it was $20,000. That's an incredible jump for those players. So imagine playing against a guy who helped you make more money in your career. Indirectly, he's lobbying for you, he's advocating for you. I'd have trouble getting into and bring out my best stuff against that guy, especially if you're someone who taps into more the dark emotions or anger or has to dislike your opponent. To me, this is an example where Federer is playing chess and everyone else is playing checkers. Again, this might not be intentional for him, but he has created all these small mini psychological advantages, whether it's doubts in these other players, whether it's this crazy image of how good he is and how graceful he is and how hard it is for him to be injured. And he's also creating this other force where, I helped you make more money. I've lobbied for you as players. I've made this game of tennis better for you as a whole. Man, that whole combination makes it pretty hard to put your best effort forward against someone. And this is compounded even further by Roger's view of respect. Federer celebrated by jumping instead of dropping to the ground, a form of respect for an opponent he knew and well liked. He didn't want to make Roddick wait for the handshake after a defeat as tough as this one. Sports or tennis is cruel sometimes, we know it, Federer said. I went through some 5-setters in Grand Slam finals too and ended up losing. It's hard. So he's empathetic. He's trying to make it easy on his opponents. That's a pretty incredible thing. And people remember those types of things. But it's not showing any respect and sportsmanship to your opponent, who is extremely disappointed to watch you celebrating for 5 or 10 minutes. But Roger said, believe me, I'll never do that because I know how disappointed I would have been. And I know how my opponent feels. So Roger is, again, stepping into those shoes. If he makes you mad that you lost to him in a final and you're playing him in another final, that is additional fuel that you have. If he did everything right, he handled it gracefully, he did all these other things, you don't have another tool in your toolkit to be able to pull out when you really need it when you're playing against someone that great. This is something I love. When I was in the hospital, so this is one of the guys on the circuit, I got one note from a player. He said, it was the number one player in the world, Roger Federer, saying, wish you well, come back soon. No one else really thinks about taking the time out of their schedule when they're trying to win a tournament. He really cared about all his competitors. How incredible is that? There's however many people on the ATP tour playing with them every week. Roger is the only one that sends this guy a get well soon card. All of this goodwill that Roger's built up, it pays off. So the first way it pays off is in favors. He came to us and asked us if he could use our coach, David McPherson, in the finals, Bob Bryan said. He and Stan had some losses, 3 or 4 in a row, and they knew they needed to win that match to beat France. So this is in the Davis Cup when Roger is playing to try and win. Towards the end of his career, obviously we talked before about how he was putting this off. So our coach went and gave him a couple of tips, and they executed with perfection and destroyed the French team. That just shows you how much talent and ability he has. Some people might not have wanted their coach to be used to help another team. Mike Bryan said they had no resignation in saying yes. It's an honor just to have Roger ask for a favor. He said, and if he does, we'd love to help him out. He's just wanted to learn more about the strategy of doubles because he goes out there and he uses his talent, his athletic ability, but there's some more nuances that he's used for his advantage there. So Roger, it even goes as far as his opponents wanting to help him out if he's not playing against them. He's letting them use their coaches, their physical trainers, any of these people on their team, because it means something to them to have helped Roger Federer on his path to greatness. We think a little bit about Mirka here, how she understands what it means to be one of the greatest of all time. And if she can help on that journey in any way, that's meaningful to her. To be a part of that journey, you get to grasp at the greatness and touch it and be a part of it. So this all culminates in Again, one of my belief, which is one of the greatest advantages in sports, which is home field advantage every single place that you go. For all that Rafa Nadal has achieved on the clay at Roland Garros, and no one has won more titles at any one Grand Slam, many Parisians make no secret their preference for Federer. So Nadal at this point, I believe, has won the French Open at Roland Garros 11 times. And still, when he goes and plays Federer, the fans root for Federer. How crazy is that? How hard must it be to go to what a tournament where you feel like is home and be rooted against? Perhaps Murray, who had just become the first British man to win a major since the 1930s, would have expected the London crowd to have been heavily in his favor. As it turned out, it was very much a pro-Federer gallery. It might almost have been Basil's at St. Jacobshalle. Again, you're the hometown hero. You won the first major for a British man in essentially 70 years, and they're still rooting for Roger Federer. Psychologically, that must be pretty brutal. And athletes will go out of their way to try to mitigate this, and usually it doesn't work. To cope, Djokovic tried to fool himself into thinking the crowd was on his side. They would scream Roger, and I would imagine they were screaming Novak. One, I love that from Djokovic. Djokovic and Rafa are people I am 100% going to study in future episodes, probably a season or so down the road. But that is the situation that Roger is putting his opponents into. Djokovic, greatly admired but not universally loved, has spoken of how difficult he found it to deal with the public's love for Federer. Roger is a legend of the court, and he's made history. And because of his success and because of who he is on and off the court, he's often the crowd favorite. That's difficult for me. I won't lie, it's tough. At the beginning of my career, it felt a bit strange. I was confused about how to get people on my side, he told the Times magazine. But you cannot blame the crowd. That's just the way it is. And again, this is the beauty and the art of what Roger Federer does. It doesn't seem like he has to try that hard, but he puts in the effort where it matters to be able to get people on his side. It is inherently a talent to get people to like you. And Roger has cultivated that by talking to people, by being interested in people. And he's also been able to expand on his natural abilities to do that. The problem is that the crowds are always rooting for Federer. So if you beat him, it feels like you're going to spoil the party. And that sucks for a player. To have every time you play against Federer, that's going to be tough for your spirits. Again, another little chip away at their confidence, at their psyche, at their will to win. It's not hard to appreciate why Federer keeps on winning the award for being the most adored player on tour, as voted for by the fans. His victory in 2017 marked 15 unbroken years of success in that popularity contest. 15 straight years, he was the most popular player in tennis. That is impressive. That might be, outside of all of the other achievements, as impressive as anything he's done. Because it takes so much to be well-liked. We all know now how easy it is to sour public opinion, but this is, again, something he's cultivated over and over again. And it helped that it didn't take him energy. He was just being authentic with himself. And in the long term, that really paid off. In Pete Sampras's analysis, though, the core of Federer's appeal is his humility. That is a theory strengthened in a study by the Reputation Institute, which found that Federer was the second most trusted and respected figure in the world behind only Nelson Mandela. Around 50,000 people from 25 countries were interviewed a few years before Mandela passed away, and with the Pope, Barack Obama, and the Queen trailing Federer. So publicly, globally, he is this well-liked. Again, I don't know what the secret sauce is there. Humility is probably one, being yourself and being honest, and also giving time to the press and being present with the press is probably a big factor. So when we think about this advantage, so to me, this again is unreal, that being nice, being seemingly a good person, caring for your opponents, the fans, your competition, doing all the right thing a lot of the time, that can help you win. That can help you create this crazy psychological advantage. And at the highest level of sports, the little things are what make all the difference. It's all these little things that give you an edge against your opponent. I can't quantify how many majors or tournaments he would have won or lost if he wasn't nice. But I think it's interesting to think about is that over the course of a long tennis season, over the course of a long match, you start to wear other opponents out. And all of these factors, the popularity, the media presence, the reputation, they all take their toll over time. I think that there's something similar with Tiger. So I believe it is at Firestone, it might have been the Bridgestone Invitational. There's this famous thing where all of these fans help him move this giant rock. So it's a movable impediment, but he couldn't move it himself. It was a boulder. We're talking like a 1,000-pound boulder, and all these fans come and move it for him. That's an advantage that probably no other player would be able to have because he is Tiger Woods. There are that many fans. They can help him get out of a really tough spot, and he ends up probably saving at least a shot on the hole. There are different things that popularity or celebrity or certain things that you cultivate can create, and we shouldn't look short of them. I will also say that being nice to people is a lot more actionable than getting really famous, right? If you're widely known as someone that will do things for other people, that will generally pay off for you in the long run. So part of these relationships, part of all of this stuff is centered in his mental approach to the game. In the next section, I'm going to dive into the various areas of his mental approach and how they help him to win, to get out of his own way, and to make the most of everything that he has. He's got no ego, Mike Bryan said. I've seen him before, big finals, because sometimes we're in there with him. It's only a few guys, and he'll be laughing with his coach like it's a Sunday at the park, you know? If you think about it, there's a lot of history on the line. There's points, there's money, and he just somehow knows how to filter it out and stay in the present. So something we're going to touch on a lot in this section of the mental approach is how does he stay in the present? How is he seemingly perpetually in flow? Roger does this incredibly well in all areas of his life, rather than just some people when they're in their field of play. Roger was very relaxed, very at ease, pretty much nonchalant, Rossett told me. I think it was a bit of the South African side he got from his mother. There was nothing Swiss about that. What fascinated me about Roger then, and still, is that he manages to live in the present. He has a great ability to take things as they come. He lives a moment, experiences it fully, takes pleasure in it, and finishes it, and then moves on to the next. It's for that reason you have the feeling that things happen very naturally with him. It's a talent, and to be honest, it's a talent that even today fascinates me more than his tennis. So Roger, we talked a little bit about in his joy of his career and in his life and in the experience, he's taking everything one at a time, and he's loving the process as he goes. For me, that's something, again, I believe we can cultivate, probably a little bit of an outlook thing rather than something that you specifically cultivate over time. Wawrinka was asked what Federer's most precious advice had been. The importance of living in the moment, Wawrinka said. For 20 years, he's had to deal with the daily demands of the press, the fans, the travel, the tournaments, and training. His days are ultra full, and yet he remains amazingly calm. Even when he has to do something he enjoys less, he does it to the max, better than anyone. Over the years, I've also tried to get closer to that. So he's perpetually in the present. We talked about living in the present. We talked about mindfulness in the episode with Kobe Bryant. Hopefully, again, I'll bring on George Mumford or someone who is a coach around mindfulness, a coach around using that to get into flow states. But to me, it seems like a lot of these high performance states like flow come very naturally to Roger. And that's rooted in his view of the game, his view of the lifestyle, as well as his approach to the game itself. Something that is repeatedly attributed to him is his playfulness. And playfulness, as we'll learn when we study flow more, is one of the major triggers of a flow state. And he seems to be able to keep this in almost every area of his life. He would do this especially when he was a kid growing up. And while he matured in some ways, it seems like he was able to retain this playfulness late into his career, all through his life. And this is something that I believe made him free to really enjoy the sport and to perform really well. First, he would play before matches when he was a kid. He would hide, he would do all this stuff, and it was just fun for him. I saw that he enjoys tennis. He enjoyed every ball. I liked his attitude. He was like a kid that just wants to play. Raji was also up for any mischief. He was completely relaxed. You could have stolen horses with him. He was just a fun-loving, really optimistic kid. He was not one of those kids that was very cynical or had a lot of baggage or entitlement. He was just really happy. He just really seemed to love tennis and really love life. And I was really amazed just watching how he operated, because it's very hard to be that established and accomplished as an athlete and still have a relatively stable footing on the ground of who you are as a person, prioritizing life's real issues. So, of course, he had some issues when he was growing up. He would get angry. He would be upset at himself for not reaching the potential that he believed he had. But he still loved to play the game. He still enjoyed it. He still wanted to be out there. The anger and the perfectionism really only came out in the matches. Maybe the laziness and a little bit of playfulness came out in practice, but he was able to index dramatically more on playfulness and less on the laziness. And obviously his coaches, his team, everything around him pushed it in that direction to make it constructive rather than detrimental to his success. I saw how stubborn he was and also how playful he was. Very, very playful, Grovenfeld told me. It was a word that was often used to describe Federer in the early years and is still used to describe Federer by those who know him well and have experienced him hiding behind doors and surprising them. But what did playful mean exactly to Grovenfeld? Competitively playful is how I describe him at that stage, he said. Everything was a game, whether it was on the court, off the court, or in conversation. And still today, if you have a casual conversation with him, just having guys talk, there's always an element of competition to it, whether it's a joke or more serious. But because of his playfulness, it's hard for him to keep his concentration and to really stick to one thing in those days. He needed a lot of variety, and if you didn't give him variety, he would become a nuisance, like right away. So what was the solution? Variety for everyone. I'm not saying that Roger was driving our entire group, but because it was a group stationed in one national tennis center, Roger could be a disruptor. So we had to tailor the entire program to a lot of variety. So if you're looking at Roger, playfulness, competitiveness is built into who he is. It's a little bit different of a competitiveness to people we've seen before. For example, in the Kobe series, there was a little bit more of a dark shadow over his competitiveness. I wouldn't say it was spiteful, but he was angry that people were quote unquote better than him. He wanted to run people into the ground. Tiger wanted to step on people's throats when he played. If you watch the Last Dance documentary with Michael Jordan, everything seemed to rub Michael Jordan the wrong way. Roger is viewing competitiveness as a game, as a playful activity, but he still wants to win. But he is looking for that in everything that he does. Everything is gamified. If we look at Tiger earlier in his life, everything was gamified as well. To me, this is one of the big keys with improving our performance through long-term practice, is being able to gamify everything to make it fun in that way. And I think that has some really good results from what we've seen so far. He's also playful in training and competition specifically, not just in these conversations. And I wanted to hone in on that a little bit. He's still messing around, still coming up with things that, an 18-year-old would do. I think that his playability was not only on court, but also as an individual. He just likes to have a good laugh. He likes to have fun. He doesn't want to take things too serious because he's a sensitive person. So laughter and joy and messing around was very important to him. He was still the clown if you give him the chance. He likes to have fun, and part of the fun is also some explosive fun. He can explode. So playfulness is really closely tied to creativity, which I also think is really closely tied to curiosity. So these three forces are making it so that Roger, one, with curiosity, is interested in learning new things. Playfulness means he's willing to experiment with ideas and shots and different concepts. And then creativity, he's able to take those things and build them into his game, to hit shots that people wouldn't necessarily consider reasonable, to pull out the sneak attack by Roger and throw people off their game. These are, again, intimately linked. And I think that that's important for us to realize is he wouldn't be as effective if all of these factors weren't in play, if he wasn't interested in diving into each of these areas in himself. He was like a 12-year-old kid, Plank said of the time he spent with Federer that winter. He was joking around during the warm-ups, imitating Stefan Edberg and Bernard Tomic. He would shout out of the blue. I loved it. We're lucky to have and be able to share this with him. It's precious, and in terms of technique, he's still the gold standard. It's like continuing education for me, a coaching clinic each time. I have the master right there in front of me. I watch, and it's inspiring. I took 150 pages of notes. So this is one of the new guys coming up on the circuit that gets to practice with Roger. He's seeing him in his element. And Of course, there's seriousness, but there's joy, there's playfulness, all of this built into a practice that he's doing even later in his career. When no one's watching Federer's training sessions, and that does not happen very often, he loves to be a clown on the practice court. Federer was once involved in a 15-minute tennis ball fight in the locker room at one of the Masters level events, and according to one witness, a tournament mascot chose the wrong time to talk and was caught in the crossfire. So Roger is, again, a prankster. He's a little bit, willing to push a little bit, even though it's all in good nature. And I think that little bit of rebelliousness shows in his tennis game. So yes, according to the media and all these things, he's the perfect representation of the game. He's the perfect, the perfect gentleman, and has this incredible image. But he's still willing to go against convention. He's still willing to be playful and have fun and do some things that are a little bit ornery or impish as well. And I think that a little bit of that should be in every athlete. I think Shane Battier said is you need on a team, you can't have all milk drinkers. You have to have at least one whiskey drinker. And Federer, I wouldn't say is necessarily always the whiskey drinker, but he's willing to push the boundaries a little bit or see what the boundaries are. And that's what it takes a lot of the time to improve or get to the next level. When I was a teenager and got hit balls with the great Henry LeConte for the first time, I was totally tense. I wanted to present myself at my best, gave it everything, to the brink of exhaustion. And Roger, not a trace of nervousness. He was as relaxed as one can be. He didn't move much on the court. His balls flew in all directions. I had to laugh. He was so different from me when playing the professionals. So Roger is, in this circumstance, not taking it too seriously. I don't know if it's Roger looking at things in the big picture and saying, hey, in the big picture, this doesn't really mean anything. Or in the very little picture, finding the present and realizing that he's on a tennis court like he always is, and he can have fun and enjoy the moment. Those two different forces of putting things in perspective in the sense that, hey, in the long term, this is really going to mean very little in the scope of things, or in the short term, this moment is all that really matters, and I should have fun with the moment. Those are two different ways that we can perpetually find the present. It's also important to notice that, as I mentioned before, playfulness is a big contributor to flow states. And it seems like Roger is almost perpetually living in flow. He's enjoying the interviews. He's enjoying the travel. He's enjoying exploring new locations. He's in awe of all of the cool things he gets to see on the travel. He has fun in the locker rooms. He has fun on the court. He's loving the competition and the competitive fuel. It seems like he's living a very optimal lifestyle for the attributes that he has. I think another definition of flow would be that your activities are matching the attributes and the traits that you have. And Roger is doing a really good job of that. And they're matching it in difficulty, but also in interest and in diversity. There was a point, though, that Roger would tip too far onto the playfulness scale. And I believe it's really important for us to look and see how he was able to rein that in. One evening, we all met outside to cool off and do a few exercises. Roger played the clown. He deliberately jumped awkwardly with the skipping rope and promptly sprained his foot. The foot swelled up and became a big lump. That was the middle of the tournament, and Roger was already into the quarterfinals. Now he was threatened with elimination, but Federer certainly didn't want to rob himself of his title chances because of his silliness. He put all his focus on getting his foot ready to be able to continue playing. Our physio, Paul Dorochenko, only looked after Roger, and indeed, with tapes, treatments, and exercises, he managed to pull it off despite the sprained foot and win the Orange Bowl. So Roger realizes this can go far, and that was probably a very big learning moment for him where, yes, I can be playful, it helps me improve, but if you injure yourself or if you play in hazardous ways, it's not going to have good returns. That was an amazing performance by him, also mentally. Through that episode, he started to think, where's this going? What am I doing here? What does it take? He was a hilarious guy. We often had fun, but we couldn't let it go to the point where he was fooling around too much and putting obstacles in his way. Those days leading up to the final of the Orange Bowl were impressive when we could watch how he nurtured himself, how focused he was, and how he channeled his energy towards this goal. So the other side of that, we're seeing this serious side of Roger and what he's capable of doing. So there's some times where, for example, I eat a bad meal. I have a cheeseburger and French fries, something really unhealthy. And on the other side of that, I put more time in the gym because I'm a little pissed that I did that. I went into my impulses. There's a balance that all of these great athletes find where they don't necessarily negotiate with themselves, but if they make a mistake, they make it up to themselves because they're the only ones that's losing ground. If you cheat on a diet, if you don't put those extra hours in the gym, if you cut a corner in a drill, the only one you're hurting is really yourself and your reputation, maybe your team if they're connected to your success. But I see and I believe the greatest athletes view it in that way as well. Federer was pretty chill all the time, Skelly said. He definitely partied and liked his beer, as did his coach. I remember the 2000 at Wimbledon. Federer was drunk as hell at the bar in Wimbledon Village. He was definitely a happy drunk, loved the player parties in his younger days. So we talked about how Roger kind of went a different direction than Marat Safin, where he loved to party and go out and do all these things and didn't live up to his potential. There was some of that in the beginning with Roger, but he eventually reconciled and realized that probably wasn't going to be great for the longevity of his career. This is before he won his first major. This is before he beat Pete Sampras at Wimbledon in 2001. And this was early on in his relationship with Mirka. I think she probably did a decent job of reining him in there too as well. Risk taking, especially if you're a daredevil like 18-year-old Federer was back then. They chose the slope of the women's downhill race where two hills follow each other. All of a sudden, Roger roared past me as if he were Peter Mueller. So Roger has a little bit of a rough skiing accident. If we remember Tiger, he also had a skiing accident. He was going too fast. And it seems like a lot of these athletes enjoy learning, but also pushing their limits in some of these extreme sports. Maybe why a lot of them avoid them largely. I think Phil Mickelson, it was David Duval, had a snowboarding accident that sidelined his career for a while. And let's think about the changes as well. He's very silly, but he's definitely matured a little bit over the years for sure. It seems Federer also liked the odd quiz, especially if it was about his career. We never grabbed dinners together, but we've had awesome conversations in the locker room, Bob said. He has an amazing memory. He can tell you all the matches he's played and all the wins. He remembers everything. He's also playful when he's shooting on set, during commercials, doing all these things. But as we talked about before, sometimes it can go the other direction. So Roger maybe he becomes too serious or he gets too laid back. He has to find the middle ground. And this is one of the things he does best. He figures out, okay, this is where I'm at. Maybe I over-index on playfulness. Now he goes over, indexes a little bit too hard on seriousness, and finds his weaving back in. It seems like Roger finds this middle ground through a little bit of playfulness and experimentation and practice, but a lot of playfulness off the courts and with his team and in conversation. I think it's just his mindset, the way he plays, his thought that after a point, there's another point, and then the next one. He's been able to clear everything up very quickly, put things behind him, and go on to the next one. I think that's probably one of the biggest assets. And as a player, he simply takes your time away. I mean, that's enough. So again, Roger playing in the moment, thinking about the individual point at hand rather than the scope of things. That's an important thing that he learned from the sports psychologist, but it also goes into play. When you're playing, you're not thinking necessarily strategically. You're not thinking about what you're going to do next. You're thinking about how you can be creative with the individual shot, the individual point, whatever it might be. So how do you stay playful as you get older? I know that as I got older, in all the sports I played, I was dramatically less playful with my work. When it felt like work, I was also a lot less playful. And I think Roger does a great job of keeping tennis feeling like it's his hobby. He said this before, and if it's a hobby, you treat it a little bit differently. You can still put a ton of hours in, you can still put a lot of time in, but your life doesn't revolve around it. It is not the be-all, end-all goal. You're not valuing yourself based on your performance. Obviously, he does care about his goals and some of these things, but he has separated that from who he is as a person. Also, maintaining a childlike mind. I think playing with younger athletes, even rallying with teenagers and these types of things, you get to borrow some of their energy, some of their exuberance. You get to see how much fun other people have with the game. And it's great to watch other athletes who are growing up and still enjoying the game to be able to borrow and observe some of that energy. I also think short-term goals really help you to improve on the play aspect. So a lot of the times when we talk about self-talk later, Roger is telling himself to relax. He's telling himself to play free. These are things that help us to continue to stay in these states, but challenge ourselves effectively. The next part of his mindset is related to being a perfectionist. So this is an opposing force to playfulness. And this is something that Roger, again, struggled with earlier in his career. He was too much of a perfectionist. But I also don't think any great athlete gets to where they are without some touch of perfectionism. So Roger is constantly balancing perfectionism and playfulness back and forth. And we can observe a lot and learn a lot from seeing how he went about doing that. More than anything, Federer's parents cared about curbing their son's rage. When Roger's behavior was poor, I would say that he was inviting his opponent to beat him, Lynette said. We would also tell him that his behavior was upsetting us, and we used to say to him, "Come on, Roger, get control of yourself, pull yourself together." There were two types of car journeys home from the tennis club. The ones when the family argued, the most famous being interrupted so Roger's dad, could put Roger's head into the snow, and the ones when the family sat in uncomfortable silence. In time, Lynette came to understand that her son cried because he cared so deeply. The tears showed how ambitious Roger was, how determined he was to succeed. So how can a perfectionist tendency and the beautiful playfulness tendency live in the same person? I think that all great athletes are a little bit paradoxical. They don't always necessarily make sense. They don't fit together perfectly like puzzle pieces. But that friction between those two forces where they're constantly having to balance is something that continually pushes them forward. But there was also something in him that wanted full ownership, a strain of perfectionism that made him realize he would have struggled to accept other shortcomings when he already had so much difficulty accepting his own. The thing I like about Roger's perfectionism is he owns it and he believes he can control it. He also realizes he can control how he feels about these specific situations as well. I knew what I could do, and failure made me mad, Federer said of his youth. I had two voices inside of me, the devil and the angel, I suppose, and one self couldn't believe how stupid the other one could be. How could you miss that? One voice would say. Then I would just explode. My dad used to be so embarrassed at the tournaments that he would shout out at me from the side of the court, telling me to be quiet, and then on the way home in the car, he might drive for an hour and a half not saying a word. We'll touch on this later when we focus on his parents, but think about the parenting that the Federers are doing. So they're caring about how Roger comes off. They're caring about how he carries himself if he's working hard. They're not necessarily putting any emphasis on the results. And Roger is being evaluated by his parents, not on the results, but on these other things. That has been something that has been very successful in parenting and encourages the performance to be intrinsically motivated. If we look at how Roger is evaluating his own performance, it is intrinsically motivated. He wants to play the best, not to show other people up, but because he believes he's capable of it and he wants to achieve that. To me, that is a big key here, is that perfectionism, if it's for the right reasons, can be a powerful force. It can be almost a compulsion to get better that is coming in from the internal state rather than from coaches or his parents really trying to push him to clean up any and all errors. That is a very unhealthy thing. And so if we view it how Roger's doing it, yes, he's putting too much pressure on himself, but it's the pressure that he is putting on, not other people are putting on. Federer may have been prone to red hot rages, but it's not accurate to characterize his younger incarnation as the mini McEnroe of suburban Basel. Unlike John McEnroe, whose anger was aimed at others and in particular umpires, Federer's rage was primarily directed at himself. Federer was forever squabbling internally. From a young age, he felt it should be possible to achieve perfection on the court. He once admitted to a fear of spiders, snakes, skydiving, and roller coaster rides. But what he really abhorred was imperfection, and that included those times when he won the point, but was not happy with the shots he played. So Roger, I don't believe, could have been as successful a player as he was if he didn't get past this mindset. But at the same time, some element of that mindset is what keeps you practicing for hours and hours and keeps driving you forward. The only limitations that we saw were his flare-ups and his temperament. He got very impatient. I guess you can also say that his standards were very high. He expected a lot from himself, and he expected to be able to handle certain shots. I guess because of those moods that he'd get into, that also pushed him to excel. You can't just judge somebody that doesn't have the type of self-judgment and critical judgment in that sense. So one of the reasons why Roger wasn't able to execute the shots and to achieve perfection is his body wasn't there yet. His technique wasn't there yet. He had to evolve and get to the level where his physical attributes could match what his mind wanted to do and his hand-eye coordination. And this is something, again, we saw with Kobe. This is something we also saw with Tiger, where you're talking about him hitting knockdown control shots, and he didn't feel like he was strong enough to do those consistently. Skill eventually helps you to meet those expectations, and that can be a really good thing if you can eventually get to that point where your body is cooperating as well. Federer also learned to control these things, control these emotions, which I believe was a really powerful force. There's a lot of energy in perfectionism. There's a lot of energy in wanting to be able to achieve what you believe you're capable of doing. But if we turn that energy into anger, that's a bad thing. If we turn that energy into practice, that's a really good thing. There's another element of perfectionism, which is involving control. So Roger wanted control over his own emotions. He took ownership of his shortcomings, unlike McEnroe, for example. But there's other ways that we can create ownership over our domain and our behavior. Roger Federer goes through a meticulous routine before each match, and that includes sitting on his towel on the chair at the edge of the court. It also includes covering the armrests to make them softer. His water bottle goes on the ground to his left hand, his orange bottle of mineral salts on his right. His racket holder certainly doesn't go on the ground. No, it has a place in another chair to his left. The tennis bag, however, sits on the cement to his right. We talked about with Rafa in the chatter episode how controlling his environment helps him to control his mind. And this is the same with Roger. This is the same with other players. The more you can exert control over your practice scenario, your playing scenario, all these different fields, the more semblance of control that you have. In 4 hits, Roger Federer takes the game. 10 meters away, his bench waits for him, meticulously draped in towels so that each switch to a different side is as comfortable as possible, so that nothing disturbs his symphony of tennis. I was okay, but I was just never even close to 100%, Federer told me. And this was when we said, you know what? Let's call it a day and just get ready for the grass. I tried, I really tried. With his withdrawal, stopped his record streak of consecutive Grand Slam tournament singles appearances at 65, a record that has since been broken by Feliciano Lopez. But the streak never had much meaning for Federer. What mattered most to him was having a chance at winning, not participating. It still hurts to miss Paris. Even years later, Federer sounded slightly sheepish, as he should have found a way to avoid such an outcome. It's not easy for a world-class planner to surrender his plan. The trouble was that grass would offer no refuge in 2016. What I really like about this example is that it's a different type of perfectionism that actually helps him later in his career. So if he didn't feel like he could go out and win, if he didn't feel like he could get to that 100% at this stage in his career, this was obviously later in his career, he felt like he shouldn't be playing. And that gave him a reason to rest. That gave him a reason to put his all into his practice and into his recovery. I've talked in the past about how Roger was playing consistently and was injury-free and hadn't withdrawn for matches in such a long time. But that's because he was willing to give himself all of the tools he felt he needed to play at the potential that he believed he had. It helped him to make better decisions in that sense. And this perfectionism also carries on to his practice in a good way as well. There were a couple laughs here and there, but boy, when the ball was in play, it was absolutely 100% attention to detail. No messing around. I remember at one stage, Matot and the French guy started hitting the ball badly. They weren't messing around, but they got tight or whatever. Roger went fucking nuts. He was like, this is just not good enough. We're out here and trying to play. He gave them a proper lecture in a good way, I mean. It certainly sorted them out, and they got motivated, and they came out. They hit the ball great. So Roger is practicing, and he's not going to accept anything less from his practicing partners, the people around him, because that is what it takes to achieve greatness, is having everything aligned, being on the same page, and everyone putting their best foot forward. And Roger was willing to say something about it if he didn't feel like it was right and it wasn't going to help him or help the overall team. This next part, I didn't exactly know how to frame it, but I thought it fit well under his mental approach. So something we've seen from Roger is that He has a great team. They help him make decisions. They're a part of every decision that he's made. But Roger still has to make very tough decisions himself of who to bring around, of when to cut people off, of if he should be doing something or not be doing something, whether it is against public opinion or whether it's against his team or anything along those lines. I call this self-reliance because Roger, although he had this great team and all this great support network around him, he was still able to make difficult decisions when he needed to, and he went forward with that right away. He also was reliant on himself to get over adversity or get over failures in a really rapid way. And I think that this is something special that he had to cultivate, not necessarily something that he was able to get from a team. Let's talk about Roger's short memory. So he did a great job of not dwelling on things that you can't necessarily control. The surprise was that the Davis Cup did not cast a pall over the rest of his 2003 season, and that would become one of Federer's hallmarks throughout the years. The capacity to rebound quickly from disappointment, sometimes brutal disappointment. He bounces back really fast, Paul Annacone, one of his longtime coaches, told me. Yes, he gets dejected, but by the end of the night or the next morning, he's bouncing back. I've never met anyone who does a better job of finding a balance between appreciating things when they win, but still being able to move on when the bad stuff happens. Again, this in of itself is a skill. What's important is that he does feel dejected. He does feel these bad forces, but he can get past them as quickly as possible. When we think of mindfulness, when we think of meditation, when we think of some of these forces, that's one of the skills that it helps you to cultivate. I didn't see any evidence of Roger doing meditation every day or anything along those lines, but when you're practicing meditation, what you're doing is you're sitting there, and when a thought comes, you're letting it pass. And it seems at a high level, this is what he's doing. A bad thing is coming, he's letting it pass, he's preparing for the new thing to come. This is an example of how he responded after losing the French Open. So we went to Zurich for a couple of days, and then we went to Hale, and then we went on the practice court, and it was like he had just won the French Open for the 5th time in a row, The joy of hitting balls and playing the game. It put me in a good mood, to be honest. And this is something that either he learned from somebody or he was born with it. Because the ability to shake off a loss like that and not carry it with you for a while is pretty impressive. I think it's something he's done considerably through his career. Federer, who takes pride in his ability to live and play in the moment, won Hal without dropping a set to recover some mojo. So something that Federer says repeatedly is there's always another shot, there's always another tournament, there's always something next, and there's always things outside of tennis. He also has been able to leverage this on the tennis court. So when he won Roland Garros, the only time he won at the French Open in 2009, at the end of the match, when it was still really close, during the match when it was still really close, a streaker came up and tries to put a hat on Roger Federer. A lot of people could be shaken in the moment. A lot of people, that could have been very stressful. He's trying to win this tournament for the first time, which means his legacy, having won all 4 majors and all these things. And he's able to shake this off and get on to the next point. To me, that's a very impressive thing. It's not just showing it, he after a loss in a major, getting over that, which he's experienced before, but having just something completely weird happen and him being able to recover from that. Here's another example from when he lost what many people believe to be the greatest tennis match of all time in 2008, where he lost Wimbledon against Rafa Nadal. There's a good movie about that specific match called Strokes of Genius, and you really get a deep look into how both Rafa and Roger prepared for that match. I really recommend it. Oh, this is Roger. It was only later when I realized the magnitude of the match. In the moment itself, I went back. I cried in the locker room. I cried when I left the site. I still remember vividly when I walked out through the Millennium Building. I was like, oh my God, this is the worst day of my life. And you can tell me how much you want that this is a great match. I don't care. I lost. I would have rather have lost in straight sets. Then it would have just been so simple rather than going through this emotional roller coaster. So the emotional roller coaster is that Roger lost the first 2 sets, won the next 2 sets in tie breaks, and then loses the final set in tie breaks also in a really closely contested match. But by the time the 2008 US Open arrived, he could see the forest for the trees. Dejection gave way to quiet satisfaction. It would no doubt have been nice to have won one of the greatest matches ever played, but at least his sport was the winner too. So he didn't win the match, but he was a part of tennis history. He was a part of maybe one of the greatest matches of all time. He had already won that tournament 5 times in a row. It's not like he was never going to be a part of history to begin with. This is the big picture that he's able to focus on rather than the small thing that's happening right there. As much as I take things very serious, I'm very laid back. So I can really let go very quickly, he said in 2019. I truly believe this is the secret for a lot of players and for the young guys, is to be able, when you leave the site, to say, okay, I'm going to leave it behind. I still know I'm a professional tennis player, but I'm relaxing. I'm doing it my way, whatever helps me decompress. So what helps Roger decompress is his family, his team, his exploration, variety, all of these things. And I think that he knows that better than anyone else. So it's not just his mind that's telling him to leave things behind. His ecosystem he's created is allowing him to do this as quickly as possible. Something that Roger also focuses on is what he controls versus what he doesn't control. I think it works well for him because the one thing that is a lot like Pete Sampras is neither of them waste energy on stuff that they don't control. There's a feeling out there of don't screw it up, Roger, I said. Do you think about that? Federer chuckled. You can't think about that, he said, because sometimes stuff happens and you deal with it. An example of him talking about things that he doesn't control and how he views them is I believe it was in Spain. They played on these blue courts. It was a gimmicky thing based on the Spanish tournament there. And they never did it again, and because the players complained so much. But essentially the clay wasn't set and everyone was sliding everywhere way too much. And this is what Roger said. He did end up winning the tournament. He said, if I'm skating, so is the next guy and the next guy. That's what Mr. Federer told me. He's a great man and he won the tournament. So everyone's playing the same tennis courts. Everyone is experiencing this. That means there's no advantage or negative or drawback. The advantage you get is if you look at it as something that is an inevitability and everyone else is looking at it as a detriment to their game. Then you do have a mental advantage than everyone else. I have seen this in golf tournaments frequently where guys are complaining about the conditions of the course. When Jack Nicklaus saw that, he basically said, oh, there's another person who I don't have to worry about beating this week because they beat themselves. He also is described as pathologically optimistic. Mary Carrillo, a former player and now broadcaster, once spoke of Federer being pathologically optimistic. One of his former coaches, Jose Higueras, agreed. One of the things that impressed me was how he could move on quickly after a defeat. After the 2008 French Open final, when Roger won just 4 games against Nadal, I think I was more upset than Roger was. I also felt bad for Roger after he lost that year's Wimbledon final to Nadal. But Roger was facing Nadal at his peak that summer, and he didn't dwell on those defeats. Later that summer, he'd win the US Open. So the idea that tennis and performance is not static, I can get better the next day. I could figure something out through practice the next month, and it can help me to overcome one of my greatest opponents. That's also something that allows Federer to be as good as he was. He also has the mindset that he knows he's going to get better. We've talked about a growth mindset in the past and what that means. This is the epitome of that, is you believe that you can get better, and you have to be optimistic because of that. Because if there's unlimited potential that you see going forward, the future looks pretty bright. We talked a lot about perspective when we were looking at his transformation, but I think perspective plays into the everyday concept of Roger's self-reliance. I was thinking, what am I going to say afterwards? How do I figure out a speech? Anacone told me. So he does all this press, and we jump in the car, and we go back to his house, which is a 30-second ride at Wimbledon. And he literally puts down his bags, and we talk at the door, and he gets down on his hands and knees, and in 30 seconds, he's on the floor with the twins, Mila and Charlene, and they're laughing and giggling and rolling around. So Roger just loses Wimbledon to Rafa in 2008. As he described, he cried. It was the worst loss of all time. But when he sees his kids, he realizes that there are things that are more important to tennis than tennis. I'm not saying that your kids are like a tool to help you get better or there's these other things, but finding balance in these other forces, finding things that matter as much, if not more than your sport, can help you put the sports that you play in perspective. After Federer rose, Anacone suggested they take a walk for their post-match debrief. Anacone asked Federer what thought process allowed him to shake off a tough defeat and share an appropriately carefree moment so quickly with his children. This, according to Anicone, was Federer's answer. Look, I've won a lot of titles, and I've lost a lot. And I really just feel that this stuff balances out. I can give you some instances where I've won titles where I shouldn't have, and I can give you some instances where I lost at big moments. More times than not, I'm going to win those, but what drives me is just the understanding that it happens and that it does balance out. The idea of balancing out, while it might not necessarily be grounded in reality, if you view the world like that, it can be very refreshing. Is that, oh, I didn't get it this time, I will get it next time because I'm putting all the work in. It seems like that's what all of these athletes really do in the long term. Kobe believed it would work out because he put in the prerequisite hours of practice. Same with Tiger. He believed it would work out because he's doing all the right things in pursuit of his goal. And more often than not, at the highest level, if you're really doing all the things you're supposed to, it does. Look, I struggled a bit the first couple days, Roger said. At the same time, I was caravanning with my kids. I didn't have much time thinking about all the missed opportunities. I was organizing my life for my 4 children, driving around the beautiful countryside of Switzerland. Sometimes you have flashbacks, things like, oh, I should have done that. I should have done that. The next day you're having a glass of wine with your wife thinking, the semis was pretty good. Even the finals was pretty good. You go in phases. So he knows that the feelings he has are not permanent. What is permanent is the idea that he can improve and get better and make constructive progress towards what he wants. The book that I covered, Chatter, was all on self-talk. I talked a lot about how Tiger talks to himself in the Tiger episode. I like to look at how Federer talks to himself because I think it's a little bit different than how Tiger did and a little bit different than some of the things that we talked about in the other books. Federer held firm, very firm, to win 7-5, 6-3, 1-6, 4-6, 6-3, and become the oldest man to reach Grand Slam singles final since Ken Rosenwall lost in the 1974 US Open final to Jimmy Connors at age 39. It's gone much better than I thought it would. That's also what I was telling myself in the 5th set, Federer said. I was talking to myself saying, like, just relax, man. The comeback is so great already. Let it fly off your racket and just see what happens. So Roger is not telling himself to win. He's not urging himself on to try harder, to grind. He is talking to himself, telling himself to free up, to really release and to let go. And again, this is a big part of getting into those flow states. It's a big part of letting things happen rather than forcing them to happen. Virtuoso performance became his trademark, but he often took more pride later in his career from the matches where he hit quite a few wrong notes and had to pound on the keys before finding a way to get through. Those are maybe the most satisfying wins for me today, because I couldn't always show my fight and my grit, which I do believe is a big quality of mine, he said. Otherwise, I wouldn't have won over the 1,000 matches in my career. But it was always a two-edged sword. I felt like that was quite complicated for most of my career. Imagine how he's framing this. This isn't specifically how he talks to himself, but it's how he communicates what these things mean to himself. So if he gets behind in a match and he's maybe not playing that well, it means a lot to him to be able to showcase to everyone that he's a fighter, that he can come back, that he can do really well in these matches over time. And framing the bad matches in that way is probably how he got over giving up on those matches when he was behind. It became a part of his identity to be a fighter, and he would tell himself that routinely. I told myself to play free, Federer said. You play the ball, you don't play the opponent. Be free in your head, be free in your shots, go for it. The brave will be rewarded here. I didn't want to go down just making shots, seeing forehands rain down on me from Rafa. So again, this self-talk is enabling flow. This is another great way for us to be able to communicate with ourselves. It's very action-oriented on a process goal, which I think is very helpful. The last part in this section is focusing on how he's willing to make difficult decisions for himself and how those have paid off over his career. I really like this snippet from this interview of Paul Anicone, one of his coaches, on Roger's philosophy of asking questions.
I can tell you firsthand the training sessions in Dubai preseason after the U.S. Open with Pierre Paganini and Severin Luthi, it was very strategic. He spent a ton of time in the gym. He spent a ton of time on the practice court. And one of the things I found most interesting with Roger is the first time I met him, we talked about doing something, and I asked him to do it, and he said, why? And I said, what do you mean why? And he goes, well, when I was a kid, everyone used to call me the why man. I'm happy to do it, but you have to tell me why and how does it fit into my game. And that mantra lasted from the day he started to the day he stopped as a professional tennis player.
So as you can see, Roger is very inquisitive and he wants all the information so that he can make a decision himself. We talked about before when he was working with his team, he'd want multiple opinions and then he'd decide on what he wanted to do after. So although he has delegated all of these things, he has all these different areas, he is the final decision maker and he's comfortable with making those decisions. So much about sports is in the execution, is of making a decision quickly and with conviction and sticking with it. And Roger is no exception. He's no pushover regarding this as well. When Federer was 14 years old, he unilaterally decided that if he was going to further his tennis career, he needed to base himself at the Swiss National Tennis Center in Exponential on Lake Geneva. Federer did not inform his parents of this decision. Instead, they read about it in an interview he gave to the tennis magazine. We're a close family, but Roger took the decision at a very early age that he wanted to play tennis away from home. We never forced him to do anything, but let him develop on his own, Lynette said. He made a lot of important decisions himself when he was younger, and that was key in his success because he had to learn how to do things for himself. He learned to be very independent. So Roger, when you make your own decisions, you're the only one that is accountable to them. Roger's parents never pushed him towards anything, and if you're doing something electively and there's hardship, you're still probably more likely and inclined to go through it because it was your decision to begin with. That is one really interesting way for Roger to align all these things, is he did it with his own conviction and he's more liable to live with the consequences that he has. When you're making any decision, if you are the final decision maker rather than the other people around you, you're going to be more apt to stick with it, in my opinion. Talk to Federer now, and he has no regrets. Quite the contrary. He sees the 2 years he spent at Exponential as vital to his maturation and critical to his later success. I'd have to say now that those were probably the 2 most influential years I've had in my life, he said. When he gives advice to younger players, he often recommends that they take the opportunity to leave home for a stretch to build their sense of self-reliance, a key trait in a brutally competitive individual sport where trusting yourself can be every bit as hard and important as trusting your forehand. So I don't know if he explicitly made these decisions to improve his tennis game, but again, these are aligning in his pursuit of tennis greatness. When he's on the court, until I think recently, you weren't allowed to talk to your coaches or they weren't allowed to talk to you. And you're completely alone out there. You have to develop this sense of self-reliance in almost every sport that you play. Sometimes you have coaches, sometimes you have teammates, but you have to be the one that is taking accountability for all of the things that you do. And this experience of choosing this early and going off on his own was something that helped to cultivate that. But viewed through the prism of Federer's comfortable middle-class existence, Exponential was adversity, self-imposed and minor, but still adversity. It was a big part of his growth, both as a person and as a player. I think that every athlete has to face adversity. And this shows that we can self-impose it rather than necessarily having to go through something terribly bad in our own lives. For example, Peter Carter dying. We can choose adversity, and as long as we stick with it through that, we can build mental muscles, mental strength, and self-reliance in their own way. Raji developed rapidly there. After just 6 months, I noticed a big change. He didn't let himself get rattled so quickly on the court anymore. He no longer looked what people were doing around him. The decision for Exponential was groundbreaking for his career. He now had much more time for tennis, and he probably also felt more pressure. If he took this risk and didn't go the normal school route, he would now have to succeed in tennis. I had the feeling he was much more focused on everything he did from then on, and I soon had no chance against him anymore. And so this is one of the kids he played growing up. And it shows to me here the power of choice. If we elect to do something, we align with that, and it is, again, our own decision. We usually fully commit to that. So what things in our life can we fully commit to? What are we going to explicitly choose to do that is completely on us? It's not on our team. It's not anyone else. We can't avoid the burden of the accountability. One of the biggest choices in his life was marrying Mirka, or starting to date Mirka. We all just kind of said, Roger, no, you're too young. Just stay free a little bit longer. But he went against our advice. And he obviously made the right choice. So he's asking everyone, should I ask Mirka out? Should I do this? Should I do that? Everyone's telling him no, except for one guy who's in the Olympic house with them, who is, I believe, a wrestler. But he ends up just going, okay, I'm going to do this, starts dating her. And she's, I would argue, one of the best things that has ever happened for his career. Roger knew best, especially even in the face of his coaches. He was willing to make that decision, but notice he still asked everyone their opinion. Roger also was willing to make hard decisions with his coaches. I also felt that Peter Lundgren would have been a little bit stronger of a backbone for the press, he said. I expected that it would be really difficult for Roger because with the expectations of being number one in juniors and winning the Wimbledon Junior Championships, the pressure would be upon Roger's shoulders and he would need somebody next to him that could actually take some of the heat. Carter, he felt, might have been given a harder time because he did not have the same experience as Lundgren. So this is the first real big decision that Federer had to make that was difficult. So he chose to go with Peter Lundgren instead of Peter Carter as his traveling coach. So Peter Carter, great friends with him, his coach for 10 years growing up, emulates his style after him, is great friends with the guy. But he didn't have the necessary tool set for when Roger was going on the road. Peter Lundgren he broke into the top 25 as a player himself, and so he knew more what to expect. Peter Carter did not have that experience. So Roger is willing to do the logical thing here and go with Lundgren here. But Roger is also willing to split from Lundgren when he felt that it was needed. But first came a December surprise. At the end of a breakthrough season with a top ranking in close range, Federer announced that he and Lundgren were splitting. But just as Federer had made a tough decision to travel on tour with Lundgren instead of Carter, Federer made another risky choice to change a winning team. This was a pattern through his career. Federer, for all his conviviality and loyalty to boyhood friends like Jes Allegro and Marco Guidanelli, was not too sentimental to break bonds when his inner voice was shouting that he needed change. Federer said that he had fallen into a routine. At the end of the season, we both felt that it wasn't like it used to be, Federer said. I let him know my decision last week. He was disappointed, but he understood my arguments. We always signed one-year agreements. We arrived at the end of the cycle. I like how Roger is building in these coaching commitments into one-year increments. He is creating a forcing function for him to reevaluate these things over time, to not get stale, to seek variety. And if one of the things that is most important for Roger is variety, keeping the same coach for too long might be a detriment to that. To me, it's really impressive that he was able to make that decision and break a winning thing. So with Lundgren, he won Wimbledon in 2003. The next year, he's gone. Their dynamic had changed with that victory at the All England Club, Federer believed. You're looking up to your coach before, and then all of a sudden the coach is looking up to you. Some of the respect that Federer had once for Lundgren had seeped away. That's also an important thing to notice, is Federer had now gone way further than his coach had, way further than any of the other players that his coach had coached, and that changes the dynamic. And it's important to be observant of these types of things. And to me, it's incredible that Roger and probably Mirka at this point in time were willing to make these necessary changes to evolve. It could be very easy to say, hey, we just won a major, we should keep things going. The greatest of all time do not think like that. They think, how can I win 2 majors next year? How can I win 4 majors at one point in time? Federer had no official coach at this stage, highly unusual for a great young player who could have met the salary demands of any coach of his choosing. But Federer was in no hurry to replace Lundgren. Federer is also willing to take the time he thought he needed to take in order to find the right person for the job. The last thing I wanted to touch on with this self-reliance concept is Federer making important sacrifices in order to maximize his play. It's been hard for me not to do it, he told me in 2010. I wish just once in the last 6 years we could have won the first round without me, and I had a chance to step in again in the quarters or something, but it never happened. So it's been unfortunate, but I think the day will come that I'll want to play with the guys because they're all best friends of mine. For me, it's heartbreaking to take that decision, but I can't chase all my dreams at once, so some have to wait. So this is Roger talking about playing in the Davis Cup. He would have played if they got through the first round. The rest of Swiss tennis wasn't able to get through the first round of the tournament. And it's something he's had to not give up on, but delay because his own career was more important. And he had to make that very hard choice of playing for himself rather than necessarily playing for Switzerland every year in the Davis Cup. He did go on to bring Switzerland a Davis Cup late in his career, is 2017, 2018, or 2019. It was somewhere in that range. But he did have to make that hard decision to give that up on the way. So there's a lot of these different elements of Federer's mental approach. We have the playfulness side. We have his perfectionism. We also have his self-reliance and his ability to make his own decisions. I think all of these are important forces in how we approach any game, any practice, even our careers. And I would, again, turn this on us all to say, okay, what is my mental approach? Am I self-reliant on these things, or am I letting other forces make my decision? Am I letting the force of public opinion make a decision for me? Am I letting my team make the decisions for me? Should I make the decisions and hold myself accountable if I can? We're getting to the end here. I only have a couple sections left. This next section is on structure and freedom, which I call the alternating current. To me, this is a really interesting thing. When we were early in Federer's career, we saw how disorganized he was. We saw how his room was completely untidy, completely unstructured. He was lazy getting to the courts. There was struggle with that. Later in his career, when he met Mirka, we saw that there was a tremendous amount of structure that was imposed and that he really enjoyed when that was being built around him. I want to highlight how structure enables freedom and how both of those factors play a big role in Roger's life. There are people who are as great as Roger in different sports, but there's no chance that Jordan or Tiger had the ease of operation Roger has day to day. So the structure and the team and the system that Roger has around him, and his own dedication to certain things, his ability to say no, his ability to be self-reliant, allow him to operate differently and more carefree than pretty much any other athlete of his caliber. Federer was widely perceived as a natural talent, and yet he became a meticulous planner who learned to embrace routine and self-discipline, plotting out his schedule well in advance and in considerable detail. So this seems to go along with his carefree, playful nature, all of these other things, but structure is one of these things that allows him to enable a lot of the things that he enjoys. And it enables him to play tennis. It enables him to have fun on set when he's working on different things. It allows him to spend time with his kids. The things that he's building in are facilitating all of the things that he loves. I usually have an idea of the next 1 to 1.5 years and a very good idea about the next 9 months, he said in Argentina. I can tell you what I'll be doing Monday before Rotterdam and what I'm doing Saturday before Indian Wells. I mean, not hour by hour, but I pretty much talk it through day by day. To me, this is pretty incredible, is that he has so much organization and so much structure. He just has to show up and execute. He doesn't have to think about what's going on. And he's outsourced a lot of this thought to these other people. I personally wonder how he goes about doing this, if he has specific chunks where he does all this planning, or if it's more iterative by nature. That's something I would love to ask him one day. Federer is an intriguing blend of order and spontaneity, or perhaps it's not a blend, but more like an alternating current. It's as if all the planning is what allows him to be in the moment, fully present, and he seems particularly resistant to outside influences interfering with his natural cycle. So we've heard about this before with Kobe, how structure enables freedom. I put it in a tweet the other day, but I'm a huge believer that routine, structure, organization is in when we do things, not how we do things. And that's what I believe Roger is doing as well. When he practices is non-negotiable. How he practices, the variety and all these things are up for grabs every single day, and that's what keeps him engaged. There's also this need for control that he has that I think is in all great athletes. You need to know what's happening, but you also want control of as many outcomes as you can have. But he also sensed something in himself that many great athletes who chose tennis have sensed. A desire for control, for agency. I wanted to have the victory or defeat in my own hands without having to depend on others. So when you want control, there are things that you have to sacrifice. You can't necessarily always have other people doing things. If you are going to delegate to a team, you have to really trust them. There's a lot of vetting that you have to do. There's all these things that add up to control. And I think Roger was willing to do all those other things. Other athletes that want control, they usually just make their circles smaller and smaller. They give other people less and less responsibility unless they really trust them. And then they kind of isolate themselves because they can really only control themselves in certain settings. Wasn't it always hectic around Federer? Tweetanelli shakes his head. He was able to shield himself well. When we went out to eat, he usually had his corner, so we still had our privacy and could talk without everyone listening. He says Federer hasn't changed due to the hype surrounding him anyway. I have no comparison. I don't know anyone else since childhood who became a superstar afterwards, but I'd say he's a role model in how he's dealt with it all. So Roger is premeditated in where he eats. He's premeditated about the places he goes. He realized if he went down the street, he'd be completely overwhelmed. So he picks and chooses these things. It is a necessary sacrifice for all of the things that he wants. He's also chosen a unique environment as a buffer. A lot of tennis players have. And I think that it's a little different in comparison to some of the celebrity athletes we see now. And they also have control over it, unlike, for example, basketball players. Both Federer and Nadal were also, on a more fundamental level, anchored in a culture with egalitarian values that tempered their sense of self-importance and also allowed them to live without being hassled or hounded. Federer in Switzerland, Nadal in the calm cocoon of Mallorca. So both of these guys were able to diffuse a lot of the public and media and attention because of where they chose to live. As that comment suggests, Switzerland is a country that emphasizes discretion and an egalitarianism from early school days onwards, and Federer believes the respectful, understated atmosphere helped him prolong his career. I really feel like I can come back to Switzerland and decompress. A lot of professional tennis players also choose Dubai. Federer has a place in Dubai. It seems like there's more anonymity. There's less people running in your face and trying to get pictures with you, which is a lot more common in the US, frankly, and some places in Europe. I guess at the highest level, figuring out where you live can be a huge factor in your overall career. So a lot of golfers, for example, live in West Palm Beach. It's not a massively big city, but there's great golf competition, there's great golf courses, and there isn't as much media attention in those areas. So finding an area and building it into your lifestyle and the things you want to extend your career can also be very important. As Federer once disclosed, I have to constantly remind myself where I come from and to tell myself who I am. He's able to do that, he told the Zurich newspaper, by returning to a normal life. That sense of normality is enhanced by the knowledge that what happens in his personal life will remain private. Federer's circle does not leak. So Roger also exerts control over his circle in the sense that he chose these people very carefully. It is a safe place for him to go. And historically, other athletes haven't necessarily had that. So you look at Tiger, where people go in and out of his life. If you break his trust, you're a little bit excommunicado. You look at Kobe, who essentially stopped communicating with his parents because they didn't like his decision, some of the decisions he made. So I think it's important for us to look at how this all might fit together. And the lifestyle that Federer has is probably, in my mind, slightly more desirable on that front. He also still is able to delegate. And I think that this is a huge part of his life. His wife, Mirka, knows him so well, she can start making the decisions for him. His agent, Tony Gotzik, can also do that as well. Severin Luthi also has this ability. It takes time to get to know people, but once you build those relationships, then you can start really outsourcing well super effectively. It takes time to learn how someone else thinks. You can't just expect someone to come in and execute and do a great job. Mirka started to run the apartment for us, thankfully, so that was lucky, Federer told me with a chuckle. Michael and me, we still laugh about it. Michael came in to visit me, and we had dinner, and we talked about it again, how good it was to have Mirka in our lives. Finally, we could find stuff, and finally we could breathe normally again from all the dust being cleaned up. Mirka helps me out, Federer said. I like it tidy anyway. I used to be so untidy. There was a time when I didn't want to be tidy. Now, maybe it's nice to have a little order in a disorderly world. So, order in a disorderly world, that's one of the big things we talked about with Roger creating this children's corner everywhere he goes, with Rafa and Roger being very meticulous with where they put things on the court and keeping this routine and keeping this structure and being very anal and detail oriented with these things. If you can add structure, you have something to hold on to when everything else is in chaos. More importantly, when you're married and a father, your time and priorities shift. Also, he says this himself, because Mirka is central to his life, she organizes it, just like his mother did when he was young, and Federer feels comfortable with this arrangement. Her support is tremendous. Without her, I couldn't do what I'm doing. If she came to me one day and said, "You'll retire tomorrow," things would be potentially quite different. Roger was a guy that looked for stability in everything he did, Grobenfeld said. And you can still see that he looks for that support system. He needs to have people that are around for a long time, like Severin Luthi, who has been with Roger for so long. That's why the loss of Peter Carter had such a great impact, because he was a steady voice for Roger. So Mirka came more into the picture in 2000 during the Olympics, and that's when they started off their relationship. And here they were, 21 years later, they're still together and have 4 kids. Something that Roger does particularly well is that, and his team does particularly well, is that they optimize for freedom. So in the structure they create, they're optimizing for Roger to do a lot of the things that are important for his career. This is very different compared to how a lot of early agents come in. You look at Tiger Woods, when he came in as first agent at IMG, they were just trying to have him make as much money as possible. And that took away from his practice time. That took away from his social battery. That took away from a lot of things. Roger and his team were very conscientious about this going in. He was adamant that he didn't want to sign deals just to have deals. It was far more important, he thought, that he had more time to train and to play and to be free in the mind. In those early days, he imagined that being a tennis player meant training hard, hearing the roar of the crowd on center court, perhaps doing the occasional interview, and popping in here and there for the odd personal appearance. He had not spent much time considering the business side of the game. When he'd started to dominate the tour, he almost hadn't signed any contracts, since he and his parents always had the policy to have only a few, but of very high quality partners. And then when he returned to IMG, his market value and reputation was already that high, and they could basically choose their partners and get huge contracts. So again, Tiger coming in, he was the opposite. He was bombarded with all these contracts right out of the gate, and he had to navigate those. And public opinion of him wasn't very good necessarily when he came out, because he took on all these obligations and he wasn't necessarily ready to fill them. As a 18, 19, 20-year-old kid, the expectation of all of these sponsors, all of these different constraints on your time, that's completely unreasonable to me. I don't blame Tiger in any sense related to that. But Roger's approach and Roger's family and all of these things, it was probably a little bit by design, but it was also a little bit that he didn't have as much publicity and public eye on him coming out. Federer explained to me then that he enjoyed his independence and did not want to overcommit to sponsors because of the demand that it would generate on his time. But he clearly took note of the disparities and the demands on Mirka, who was busy managing his media relations and agenda. Roger will only work with brands that mean something to him, said a key figure on the Swiss tennis scene. That means only companies who fit with how he sees himself and his place in the world. For example, Moet and Chandon, I think I'm pronouncing that right, approached Federer. He spent a while mulling it over. With hindsight, he wonders what took him so long. Another important consideration is how many days he'll need to give to his prospective sponsor, and whether he can spare the time in his already busy schedule. But once Federer has committed to a commercial partnership, he does whatever he can to make it work, including providing creative input. So Roger is saying a lot of no's, but when he finds one he likes that aligns with who he believes himself to be and his schedule, he is all in. So if you think about it, this is really all about playing better tennis, not necessarily about making more money, but those things are intertwined. If he finds a balance and can play great tennis and win even more, that increases his value and his ability to work with partners that he really cares about over time. He also would pay more money to facilitate his career as well. And if we think about our return on investment, I think it's really important to think about it not just in terms of how much things cost and what we get out of it, but also how much time we get back or how much peace of mind we get. I don't need all this, Federer told me, gesturing toward the plane. It's just so easy, so simple. It's just an investment in yourself in terms of energy and management. We invest in ourselves and we think of terms financially, but we don't necessarily think of things in terms of energy and management. And this is Federer on retirement and how he is viewing that when he's playing. What I'm trying to do is really keep it as flexible as possible for afterwards, to really see what shall we do. He said, how much tennis, how much business, how much family. Of course, I'd like to have all the options open for my kids and Mirka first, and then go from there. What I don't want to do is commit to something too soon and then regret it. So yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. I've always said the more I think about retirement, the more I'm already retired. I feel like if I plan everything for my post-career, I'll feel like I'm halfway there, half retired. And that would affect your performance, I asked. Well, not my performance per se, but maybe my overall desire to want to do well. I can figure it out when I'm retired. I'm not feeling stressed about it. He had been thwarting other players' timelines for him for years. That to me, that view of retirement is particularly interesting as we talk about structure. So the structure that he imposes informs his tennis. It informs all of these other things. So he's very meticulous and conscious about planning retirement because that could have implications on his playing career or how he views it or his desire. To me, that is very self-aware. And I really have to give Roger all the credit in the world for how self-aware he is about a lot of factors. To me, that is maybe one of the greatest strengths that he has over many of the other players. He often has to say no in his life, but when he says yes, he is fully involved. He doesn't do things by halves. If he's there, he's not distracted or has to do something else besides. You always know where you're at with him. He doesn't agree with everything. He says when he doesn't like something, but I've never experienced him being moody. You can trust him fully. What a type of guy to be around, what a type of person to work with. If he's acting like that and he's fully committing to the things that he chooses, he's probably giving really good effort into everything he does. And if we relate this back to flow state, if we're fully committed, fully immersed in everything we do, we're not thinking about these other things because we haven't organized them correctly. If you have ultimate faith that you can give everything ultimate attention because everything else has been taken care of and organized, then you're going to execute in a very effective way. This also bleeds into long-term thinking as well. Knowing your limitations does not sound very sexy, but it was that self-awareness which would help Roger Federer become the most successful man in Wimbledon history. In the early months of 2017, others might have suggested Federer's return was a giddy revival, but he was not getting carried away with himself. Complacency has never been an affliction for the Swiss. So Federer took the decision to skip the clay court season in its entirety and instead put all of his energies into preparing for the All England Club's grass, a surface that he studied more than the Parisian brick dust. So he is organizing his schedule, all of these things around his goals. It is to win again at Wimbledon, to fully prep for this over the longer term. When he's getting older, he doesn't necessarily think he can compete across 4 majors a year, playing a ton of tennis. Let's hyper-focus and organize our plans around our goals. Honestly, I'm incredibly surprised with how well this year is going and how I'm feeling, Federer disclosed. I knew I could do well again, maybe one day, but not at this level. I guess you'd have laughed too if I told you I was going to win 2 Grand Slams in a year. People wouldn't have believed me if I'd said that. I also didn't believe I was going to win 2 Grand Slams this year. It's incredible. So his planning as he's getting later into his career is all focused on freeing him up to play as well as he can. He's not worrying about the grind. He's not worrying about money. He's not worrying about ranking. He's planning all these things to peak at the right times because that's what a win is for him at that stage. That is what a goal is for him at that stage. And all of this stuff feeds Roger's spontaneity. So if he has time, if he has structure, if he knows what he's doing and when he has to do things, he can be spontaneous in those moments. We couldn't believe Roger was hitting balls with Mark. No athlete in the world would do that so shortly before a big match. He was so spontaneous. We savored every second of it. The Kyrgyzstanians flew back that same evening, full of positive emotions, and Federer easily won his match against Kohlschreiber in straight sets. This is more in his nature, this free-flowingness, the spontaneity, all of these things. And if you can imagine how he would have lived without a team, without structure, with all these things, how bad could spontaneity go awry? And so if you're giving confines to the spontaneity, you can see it more often, and you could bring it out when you need it the most on the tennis court, on the practice court, in really fun, joyous moments like helping a kid and giving a kid a memorable experience over the course of his life. So the question is, do we need more structure in our lives? Do we need less structure in our lives? How can we create more freedom for ourselves? I'm a huge advocate, and I've been trying to do better myself with organizing everything and really giving myself time to work and time to dedicate to different projects. With this podcast, I'm reading and studying probably 50, 60 hours a month. I'm also recording for quite a few hours, and it's a time commitment along with my regular job. How do I organize around my schedule, around the obligations that I have, around my girlfriend and my leisure activities and my recovery from my shoulder surgery? How do I do all these things as effectively as I can. And by giving structure and when I'm going to do things, that allows me to maximize how I'm performing and hopefully getting all these out on time. Should we also delegate? There's a lot of things that I wish I could do that I can't. Again, podcasting is the easiest example for me right now, is that I'm delegating all of the video editing to my video editor, someone I've worked with for a long time, someone who is a core part of my team who I genuinely appreciate. Thanks, Tony. There's other aspects that I haven't felt like I could delegate yet, but how do I meet those people? Should I even be meeting those people to be able to help with certain things? How much of this should I own versus the other aspects of that? And how should we plan? What are our goals? What will we like to happen? And how do we line everything up so that all of the things that we're working on are completely aligned to where we want to go? I, for the last couple of years, have been doing a lot of speaking, doing keynotes, doing those types of things. And I realize those don't further any of the goals that I have. And so I should probably stop doing them if it's going to take a lot of time to prep, a lot of travel that is hard on my body. I should be focusing on other things that are more aligned with exactly the things that I would like to achieve in the future. The last topic in part 3 is focused on memory. I just thought that this was particularly interesting. I had seen this theme with every athlete I've studied, and I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into it. Why does it seem like all of these great athletes have incredible memories? This is one of Federer's friends growing up. What I find insane is that Roger can still remember every detail of our matches, and he even knew some of the scores. I think he genuinely cares, she said. And speaking to him, you can tell how much this guy loves his sport. I mean, if you could ask him about a match he played however many years ago, he probably could tell you the exact thing that happened. He loves it, and seeing somebody at the top of their game genuinely care about the future of tennis is something that I appreciate. He's very silly, but he's definitely matured a little bit over the years for sure. It seems Federer also liked the odd quiz, especially if it was about his career. We never grabbed dinners together, but we had some amazing conversations in the locker room. He has an amazing memory. He can tell you all the matches he's played and all his wins. He remembers everything. He told me that his memory worked like a slideshow, one image giving way to the next. Me on my knees in disbelief, he said, the racket dropping right next to me, the orange clay so vibrant and vivid, holding the trophy and kissing it, tearing up during the anthem. Those are the moments I see most right now. So first, Roger remembers a tremendous amount about what happened. He remembers the situations and the experiences, but he also sees these memories visually. If you're thinking about crying, you're also linking these things to emotion. You're linking all of these things together. Memory is a function of a lot of our senses, and the more different senses we attach to a memory, the more likely we are to see it. Sports, which are very physical, you have physical memory, you have visual memory, you have the sights and the sounds, the sensory experience, and that probably contributes largely to why these athletes have such good memories. It also might be innate to them, where having a good memory lets you recall really great experiences that you've had, good shots that you've hit, and you're able to relive those in some sense to be able to draw power from them or confidence for them. You also, if you can control your memory, you might be able to forget the bad things that happen and perhaps learn from them by remembering them in the future. He has an incredible memory, remembering everyone he played with on the junior tour. And the stories from back in the day. Do you know anyone who doesn't like Roger? Maybe one says, I prefer Nadal, but I don't know anyone who doesn't like him. He's friendly to everyone, not because he has to be. It's just the way he is. Because he loves people with empathy. He's reminded me of Andre Agassi. So he's not just remembering tennis shots, he's remembering people, he's remembering names, he's remembering experiences. And that could be a function of practice. If he genuinely wants to be well liked and connect with people, remembering their name, remembering stories about them is a great way to connect. So while Novak Djokovic, Petchy said, could recall almost every point and the dynamics involved, Federer was more intuitive. He remembered points, but focused on the bigger picture. Sometimes he had set plays like his kick serve out wide to Novak's backhand indoors, but otherwise Federer did whatever he wanted to do. This brings me to the research that I looked into memory of athletes, but also chess masters. So I found an interesting study where if you have a chessboard that is of any game that's been played, most chess grandmasters, if you show them a picture of it, they can place all of the pieces. They remember everything that was there. And a normal person cannot. That's too much complexity for us to evaluate. If you do the same thing with chess grandmasters, but you place the pieces randomly in the sense that they are not aligned with how a game would work, then they are just as good as the average person at recreating that from memory. And what that tells us that chess masters, they're seeing patterns on the board. And with great athletes, they're probably seeing different patterns in play that they're able to recall. And remembering these patterns also help them to perhaps remember performance or evaluate performance or react more quickly. To me, this was really interesting, is that these great athletes are practicing the patterns, they're reviewing the patterns, and maybe the pattern recognition and the pattern structure that they create is great memory is a byproduct of that. So again, something I was curious about, hypothesized about, wanted to research a little bit more about that and share this in this episode. I realized it made it a little bit longer, but I thought it was really interesting as well. So this is part 3. We obviously covered a ton of ground. Hopefully it'll give you a good idea into some of the very unique ways that Roger was able to get an advantage. I think through all this episode, it was probably 3 some hours, but I'm sure there was at least one thing in there you can pull away. You're like, okay, I can add this to my game. I can create value. And just by listening to this much and thinking about this much, you're getting an advantage on everyone else. No one else is willing to go, aside from the listeners, is willing, and I guess me, are willing to go as deep into these things to find the little nuggets that help them get further. The details are what makes these athletes great. And I have to commend you. You guys are all deep into the details. So we started with tactics. So what strategy are we using? And how do our skills fit into that strategy? Is there something that we're particularly good at that we can maximize? Or are we really good at a lot of things that we can combine together into a successful plan? Now onto the technical details. So what are the underlying things that we do that we can attach strategy to? Are there fundamentals that we can build on that make us better overall and that make all the other parts of our game very effective? How do you view competition? So are they making us better? Are they hurting us? If we look at technology, for example, Mark Zuckerberg believes that technology in that space, competition is good. It's always good for the consumer. It's also good for companies because they're forced to innovate. Roger loved his competition because they made him be the best tennis player he could possibly be. To that point, what is your reputation? Do people like you? What are they saying about you? Is it helping your cause or is it hurting your cause? And then what is our mental approach? So are we playful? Are we too much of a perfectionist? And are we self-reliant enough to get out of our own way and to actually get things done? To be able to take that accountability on us in order to see things through more frequently. And then finally, how do we optimize our lives? Are we overstructured? Are we not structured enough? How do we build more structure into what we're doing, whether through delegation or just through better systems that we have? Thank you again for tuning into part 3 of this series. If you made it this far, please give yourself a pat on the back. If you want to help the show, if you enjoyed this, please leave a rating or a review. These are incredible for showing people that there's a nice community here and that this is valuable work for people who are trying to get better. I'd love you to share this with a friend. Please do that. Someone who is driven, either an athlete or someone who's pursuing the pinnacle of their craft. Also, tag me on socials. I have linked all of the Twitter, I have an Instagram, or LinkedIn or any of these places in the show notes. And those are some of the best ways to let me know if you enjoy it, what I can improve. Also, if there are any books or other podcasts or interesting pieces of information you'd like me to observe. I'm also taking call for which athletes you'd like me to study. So please let me know. The next series will be on Michael Phelps after I go through part 4.